Back in 2019, my girlfriend and I rented a small cottage on a split lot. It was tucked away behind a larger main house, and the place was tiny, but the layout inside was really bizarre too. You walked straight into what clearly used to be an old screen porch that someone had poorly converted into a sort of cramped dining nook, I guess you could say. But from there, you took a step into a galley kitchen that followed into a living room. Squeezed off the side were two small bedrooms and a bathroom. The master bedroom was at the very back of the house. It had this tiny bathroom, and right beyond that was this weird, poorly integrated extension. The landlord had obviously tacked it on years later. The main house had these sort of dark hardwood floors, but the moment that you stepped into the extension, it switched into these ugly, cold blue and white checkered tiles. That sudden change in the floor always felt jarring and out of place, even before everything started happening. The first weird thing that happened was on a Saturday morning around 9 o'clock. We were both lying in bed. The headboard of our bed sat straight against the wall that shared a structure with the outdoor tool shed. And suddenly, we heard 3 loud, distinct knocks from inside of the wall. It was a solid wood and drywall, and the sound was incredibly close, not like someone hitting the exterior siding or anything. My girlfriend joked that it was a ghost and sort of rapped her knuckles against the wall 3 times. And the wall, it knocked back instantly. 3 times, same rhythm as hers. She sat up totally weirded out and tapped a quick 5 little beat pattern, and the wall copied it perfectly, beat for beat. I jumped in and tried a completely different scattered rhythm, and the wall mirrored it without missing a second. We both tried to convince ourselves that it had to be air pockets in the plumbing or the pipe vibrating against a stud or something, because the alternative felt way too crazy for us. But that wall, it didn't have any water lines running through it that I knew of. It was just a dead structural partition. After a few minutes, we stopped playing along and the noise stopped. A month later, I was home alone around 8 in the evening, and my girlfriend was out with some co-workers. I was sitting at my laptop in the spare bedroom that we used as an office. The house was dead quiet. Suddenly, I heard the heavy front door click open and swing shut. I heard footsteps crunch across the dining nook floorboards, walk up the step, and pace through the kitchen into the living room. Assuming that it was my girlfriend coming home early, I called out, "Hey, you're back quick." Nobody answered. I thought that she was just exhausted or maybe on her phone, so I didn't get up. The footsteps kept coming, moving out of the living room, down the short hallway, and stopping dead right outside of my open office door. Then, all of a sudden, right next to my ear, close enough that I felt a tiny shift in the air, I heard a man growling at me. I whipped around so fast that my chair almost flipped. The doorway, though, was completely empty. The hallway was dark and totally still. I checked the front door, it was locked tight. I blamed it on working a 12-hour shift, and I tried to shake it off. About a week later, we were both sitting on the living room couch watching a movie around the same time, 8 p.m. From where the couch sat, you had a direct line of sight through the office doorway and out its back window, which looked into our tiny fenced-in yard. I stood up to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. As I crossed the room, I glanced through the office doorway, and I swear to you that there was a face pressed against the glass of the back window. It was a completely pale man with a completely shaved head, just staring inside. I literally gasped, grabbed a heavy flashlight from the counter, and ran out the back door trying to confront this prowler. But when I got there, the yard was totally empty. There was no sign of the guy anywhere, no trampled grass where I thought that he was standing. The gate was still latched from the inside, and there was absolutely nowhere for a grown man to run in like 2 seconds that it took me to get outside. A few nights after that, we were back in bed scrolling on our phones when the sliding glass door on the master bedroom extension started violently vibrating. It didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like someone had grabbed the handle and was actively trying to rip the door open, shaking it back and forth with a terrifying force. The blue tiles were practically buzzing and almost popping out of their sockets. We both jolted out of bed. I yanked the curtains back, but that little back porch was completely bare. Nothing had been knocked over, and the lock was fully engaged. That's when my girlfriend broke down and admitted that the door had shaken like that twice before while I was at work, apparently. But she apparently hadn't told me because she thought that I'd tell her that she was losing her mind. The atmosphere, though, in the house after that became completely suffocating. The air always felt thick, and our relationship actually started falling apart because of the stress of it all. And by winter, we decided to break the lease early and just part ways. On moving day, the house was completely cleared out by late afternoon. Around 8 that evening, I drove back to the empty property, alone, to grab a box of cleaning supplies and do one final walkthrough before handing over the keys. And the second that I unlocked that front door, I was hit by this heavy, overwhelming smell of sulfur. It was an absolutely horrible smell. I checked everywhere in that place too to try and figure out where that smell was coming from. The fridge was unplugged, the stove was cold, the house had been totally vacant for 24 hours at least, and I couldn't find a source for it. My skin instantly went entirely cold though, and I ran through the empty rooms, threw the cleaning supplies into a plastic bin, and I rushed out of there back to the front entry. Now, right next to the front door, there was this sort of tall, narrow privacy window thing, and as I reached for the doorknob to leave, I looked through that glass. And I kid you not, there was a solid pitch-black silhouette of a person standing right on that front step, just inches from the glass, completely blocking the streetlights behind it. And it didn't move, it was just standing there, waiting. I didn't open the door to check, though. I practically threw myself out the side exit instead, sprinted to my truck, locked the doors, and tore out of that driveway. I never went back to that place, and I literally mailed the keys to the property manager in the end. I eventually looked at the real estate listing a few months later and saw that apparently some new tenants had moved in. I really hope that they're doing okay in there because there is something wrong with that place, and I'm just really glad that I got out when I did. It's been about 10 years since this happened, but the sheer structural impossibility of what happened that night is something that I cannot shake. This was back in October of 2016. I was 17 at the time, living in a quiet residential suburb. My girlfriend at the time, Chloe, and I had gone to a late-night dinner down the highway, and on the walk back, we got into a massive, petty argument about some high school drama. By the time that we were a mile from my house, we had completely stopped talking. She was furious and stormed ahead of me on the concrete sidewalk, keeping a strict 50-foot gap between us. It was around 10:30, so it was getting pretty late, and there were some sharp shadows across the lawns, but there was still enough ambient light that I could see her perfectly. She was wearing a very distinct, oversized, bright red flannel shirt too, and we approached the intersection, and if you take the left, it goes down a steep hill directly toward my family's house, and if you keep walking straight past the intersection, the sidewalk abruptly ends and a dirt utility road runs along a massive fenced-in electrical substation before dead-ending into a thick patch of county woods. Chloe, she hit the corner first. Without hesitating, she took the left. I watched her silhouette angle around the brick retaining wall of the corner house, her red flannel disappearing from my line of sight as she headed toward my street. I kept my slow pace, letting her have her space, but barely 3 seconds later, a figure stepped out from behind that exact same brick retaining wall. It was Chloe. She hadn't walked down the street at all. Instead, she was walking straight back out onto this street, as if she had just paced in a tiny circle behind the wall. I figured that she had dropped her phone or was turning around to yell at me again or something, but she didn't look at me. She didn't even glance in my direction. She just kept a steady uniform stride, walking right past me on the opposite side of the sidewalk. Her eyes were locked completely straight ahead, her face totally blank, headed directly toward the dead-end utility road by the substation. I sort of stopped walking. I was more annoyed than freaked out. I yelled her name, but she didn't even flinch. She just kept walking with this weird robotic momentum. She crossed the gravel verge and stepped into the dark utility track. Her red shirt faded into the shadows of the chain-link substation fence. The path next to the fence is completely straight and wide open for at least 100 yards before the trees start. There are no bushes, no ditches, and no places to hide. But the second that her boots hit that dirt track, she literally just vanished. Now, she didn't run. It was like the darkness just sort of swallowed the red fabric of her shirt instantly, way faster than a human could even move. A split second later, a sound tore out of the woods. It was a full-throated, panicked scream. It was absolutely Chloe's voice, sounding completely terrified, echoing loudly off the metal transformers of the substation. A massive spike of pure adrenaline hit me. I thought that she had been grabbed or tripped into the ravine or something, so I sprinted toward the dirt track. I skipped to a halt right at the entrance of the dark path, trying to get my phone flashlight turned on, my hand shaking, and right as the screen lit up, a voice spoke directly behind me. "What the hell are you doing?" I whipped around so quickly that I almost lost my footing. Chloe was standing on the well-lit sidewalk 15 feet behind me. She was leaning against a mailbox, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and clearly annoyance. She was slightly out of breath from the walk, but completely calm. I just sort of stared at her, my brain completely stalling out. I stammered that I just watched her walk past me in the dark and heard her scream for her life. Her face completely dropped. She swore up and down that she had taken the left onto the other street, and when she realized that I wasn't following her, she had walked back up the hill to see what I was slacking off for. She insisted that she had never gone near the substation, never walked past me, and definitely hadn't screamed. We got into another massive tense argument on the rest of the walk home because I was completely hysterical. The sidewalk? It's a straight open line with 0 alleys, no deep doorways or driveways or anything. I mean, there was just absolutely no physical way for a person to walk past me, enter a fenced utility track, scream, and then reappear entirely unbothered behind my back within a 5-second window, I would say, without me seeing them double back or anything. Well, we broke up a few months later, but to this day, we still don't talk about that night. I can assure you that it wasn't a prank. The sheer terror in that voice that I heard inside those trees was real. But the girl who owned that voice, well, she was standing right under a streetlight behind me. I don't know if it was a trick of the low light or some bizarre glitch in my own head or in the Matrix or whatever, but I watched a person duplicate and walk into the dark, and I've never gone near those woods since then. This happened back in November of 2024. I decided to do a solo trek through the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, specifically the Hoh Rainforest. It's a place of emerald moss and cathedral-like silences, where the canopy is so thick that midday feels like twilight. I'm an experienced hiker, the type who weighs his pack to the gram and even carries a satellite transponder. I don't believe in getting lost, and I don't believe in local legends. So the first night I set up camp in a small clearing about maybe 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. The air was heavy with the scent of damp cedar and rotting vegetation. As night fell, the forest didn't go quiet. It sort of went vacuum sealed. No owls, no rustle of wind, just a pressure in the air that made my ears pop. I fell into a deep sleep, but the dream that I had was hauntingly vivid. I was laying in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, when I saw a pair of long skeletal hands press against the fabric from the outside. They weren't trying to get in. They were slowly tracing the outline of my body through the nylon, like a tailor measuring a suit. I couldn't move a finger. I couldn't even blink. When I finally gasped myself awake at 4:44 a.m., my ribs were really sore for some reason, and it almost seemed like the tent was vibrating with a low, subtle, audible sort of hum. I packed up in the pre-dawn grey, feeling like I'd run a marathon. As I hiked deeper into the valley, I noticed my shadow was stuttering. Every few steps it would sort of detach from my feet almost, and seemed like it was lagging for a second. A dark silhouette standing perfectly still on the moss while I continued walking. And I know that this is going to sound crazy, but I would stop and it would like snap back into place with a sickening audible click. By noon, the echoes began. I was crossing a log bridge over a glacial stream when I heard a voice call my name. It wasn't a shout though. It was a perfect sort of digital quality recording of my mother's voice. My mother lives in Florida though, and I stood frozen on the log, scanning the ferns for her, but it was only rushing water. Then I heard my own voice, the exact pitch and cadence that I use when I'm talking to myself, sort of muttering. "Don't look up, just keep walking," it said. Well, I didn't stay to investigate. I literally hiked until my lungs were burning, and when I went to pitch my tent that evening, I found the void. My heavy-duty rainfly had been mutilated. There wasn't a cut, there was a perfectly circular hole, about the size of a human head, melted or like dissolved right through the center of the fabric. The edges, they weren't charred, but they were smooth, almost like melted glass or something. Panicked, I abandoned the campsite in the end and scrambled toward an old Forest Service fire lookout that I'd seen on the map. I climbed the steep wooden stairs, bolted the trapdoor, and huddled in the corner with my bear spray. I fell into a fitful sleep that night, only to wake up to the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the wraparound catwalk outside. I looked at my pack at that point, and that's when I noticed that my side pocket was unzipped, and my first aid kit, along with my favorite wool cap, the one with my initials stitched into the brim, were now gone. I got up at that point, and I hiked out at a dead run that next morning, reaching my truck by noon. As I was pulling out of the gravel lot, a park ranger flagged me down, and he looked at my ID, then looked at me, his face turning a shade of grey. "Hey, I just saw your truck pull out here like 20 minutes ago," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't know how to answer that, so I just said, "Huh, weird." I drove 12 hours straight to my house in Seattle that day. I thought that I was safe once I was behind my own deadbolts, but 3 nights ago, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of my shower running. I walked into the bathroom and it was full of steam. I pulled back the curtain and although the tub wasn't empty, the water was still whirling down the drain, and that's when I noticed like wet, barefoot prints leading from the shower across the ceiling and what seemed to be into the air vent. Last night, my girlfriend called me from the kitchen while I was in the basement. She sounded absolutely terrified, and when I ran upstairs, she was staring at the back door. She told me that she had seen me standing in the yard, drenched in rain, holding a handful of wet cedar branches. She said that I didn't have any eyes though, just smooth pale skin where the sockets should have been. Even just telling this, my heart is thumping and I really don't know what to do about all of this. Like I said, I've never been one to believe in legends or anything, but I cannot explain any of this and I'm just freaking out about it. The gate at the logistics yards that I work at has a timestamp error that still hasn't been corrected. According to the digital log, my supervisor's truck exited the facility at 11:42, but the CCTV footage from the perimeter fence clearly shows the vehicle idling in the terminal lane until nearly midnight. I wasn't supposed to be on the yard that late. I was pulling a double shift to cover a routine error in the manifest, navigating a white label shuttle van between the towering stacks of the shipping containers. My younger cousin was with me. He'd been hitching a ride back to the main transit hub because his own car had been towed from the employee lot earlier that shift. The logistics yards at night is a grid of dead zones, really. The lights there create a harsh island of like orange glare separated by canyons of total shadow. We were idling near the Sector 4 Transformers housing, waiting for a digital gate release that was taking too long to sync. That's when the proximity sensor on the shuttle started chirping. It wasn't a malfunction too, because on the rearview monitor, a man was standing about 15 feet behind the van. He wasn't wearing a high-vis vest or a hard hat or anything. He was dressed in a dark, oversized utility jacket that looked really heavy, like it was weighed down with equipment maybe. "Is that security?" my cousin asked, leaning over the center console. I didn't answer because I was looking at the man's hands. He wasn't approaching the driver's side window to ask for credentials, that much was clear. He was standing perfectly centered with the rear bumper, holding a tablet-sized device, is what I could make out at least, at chest height. The screen was facing us, a bright, glowing rectangle in the dark. I put the shuttle in gear and rolled forward maybe 10 feet to see if he was just crossing the lane. The man didn't cross. He mirrored the move instantly, maintaining the exact distance, the glowing screen ever wavering from our position. What made the hair on my neck stand up wasn't the tracking too, it was the audio feed. You see, the shuttle's internal comm system, usually reserved for dispatch, suddenly crackled to life with a burst of static. Then a voice came through it. It wasn't my supervisor. It seemed to be the man behind us. He was talking into whatever device he was holding, describing our movements in a flat clinical tone. Vehicle stagnant. Subject A looking at the monitor. Subject B shifting in the seat. Initiating secondary sync. Something like that anyway. He wasn't talking to us. He was documenting us like we were cargo. His face, caught in the glow of the shuttle's brake lights, was fixed in a wide, frozen grimace. Not a smile of friendliness, but a muscular sort of contraction that looked almost painful. I tried to radio dispatch for the gate release, but my handheld just gave back a network denied tone. I checked my personal phone, and the battery was now at 0%, despite it being plugged into the dash charger just moments ago. The charger light was green, but the device was a brick now. "We're going through the service corridor," I whispered. I took a hard left into a narrow passage between two refrigerator containers. I didn't use my indicators, I just moved. And in the side mirror, I saw him break into a jog. He wasn't running like a person trying to catch a ride. He was running with the tablet held perfectly steady, his eyes locked on the shuttle's rear plate. We reached the automated wait station, a busier area where a few independent haulers were idling their rigs. I pulled the shuttle directly behind a massive freight truck, effectively sandwiching us between the semi and the man. I told my cousin to stay in the van, and I walked toward the wait station office. I looked back once. The man was standing at the mouth of the service corridor, still holding that device up. He wasn't hiding, mind you. He was just standing there, waiting. Inside the office, I found the night clerk, and I told him that there was an unauthorized person in Sector 4. The clerk pulled up the live feed for that corridor. We watched the screen for 3 minutes. The lane was empty. "Nobody there, man. Probably just a shadow from the cranes or something," the clerk said, turning back to his paperwork quickly. I went back to the shuttle. My cousin was shaking. He pointed at the rear window. In the thin layer of industrial dust on the glass, something had drawn a perfect circle, 4 inches across with a dot in the center. It definitely was not there when we had started the shift, and when we finally got the gate to release and we drove out, I checked my phone again. It turned on instantly. It was at 94%. I don't take double shifts anymore, and I don't look at the rearview monitor when I'm idling in the dark anymore either, because the last time that I checked the logs for that night, there was no record of any gate release at the wait station. In fact, according to the system, I never left Sector 4 at all. I've never told anyone about this because, honestly, I spent a long time trying to convince myself that I was just paranoid. But looking back at the logs and the physical evidence now, I know exactly what was happening. In the spring of 2024, I was a student at a satellite tech campus in Illinois. I just moved into a shared housing complex that felt more like a dormitory than an apartment, really. I met a guy through a local student exchange forum. He claimed that he was a visiting researcher in his early 30s, focused on some niche aspect of structural engineering or something. He had this exhausting, sort of self-deprecating way of talking, too. Every message was a pity party. I'm probably too boring for you, or people usually find my interests weird. I thought that he was just a lonely academic. I felt bad for him, so I agreed to meet for a coffee at the campus center. In person, the lonely academic vibe vanished completely. He was incredibly intense. He didn't blink enough, in fact, and he sat way too close, and instead of a normal conversation, it felt like an interrogation. He also kept steering the topic toward structural vulnerabilities. He showed me a diagram that he'd drawn on a napkin, and it looked like a layout of the campus library, but with red marks over the emergency exits. He laughed and said, "It's amazing how people think that they're safe just because a door is heavy." I tried to leave at that point, but he insisted on walking me to my building. Along the way, he kept pointing out blind spots in the security camera footage and the coverage there. He told me that he spent time at a private security firm and was disappointed that he'd never got to work on high-stakes containment sites or something like that. He said it, though, with this sort of flat, hollow tone that made my blood run cold, to be honest. The next day, I started getting system error notifications on my laptop for some weird reason. And every time that I logged onto the campus Wi-Fi, my webcam light would flicker for a split second and then go dark. I decided to go to the basement level of the archives, a place that was usually empty and had thick concrete walls that blocked most signals. I sat at a desk at the very end of a row of mobile shelving. I had my noise-cancelling headphones on, but I didn't have any music playing, and I just wanted the silence, really. That's when I heard some sort of, mechanical hum. It was a soft motorized whirring coming from the shelf directly behind me. I turned around slowly, and he was standing there, leaning against the shelving unit. He was looking at a book. He was holding a small, high-end thermal imaging device, the kind used for, checking heat leaks in industrial pipes, I think. He was pointing it directly at the back of my head, too. I only know what it was because I looked it up later, but I froze and I didn't turn around fully. I watched his reflection in the glass of a fire extinguisher cabinet on the wall. He was watching the screen of the thermal cam, his face twisted into a look of absolute ecstatic concentration, I would say. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy-duty industrial hole punch, the kind used for leather or thick plastic, I think. He held a small, clear piece of acrylic in his other hand. As I watched, he didn't say a word. He just started punching holes into the acrylic, one after another in a sort of violent pattern. But here's the detail that really made me lose it at the time. He reached out with a pair of long-nosed pliers and started picking up the tiny discarded circles of plastic. He was carefully placing them into his mouth. He would chew on them with a slow grinding motion, staring at the thermal image of my brain's heat signature apparently on his screen while he was doing it, and I could hear the plastic crunching between his teeth over the silence of the library. I didn't pack my bag. I stood up and I left my laptop and my notes on the desk and I just walked. I didn't run, but I walked toward the stairs. I knew that if I ran that he would follow, and I reached the main floor, found a group of campus tour guides, and stayed with them until I could get the security officers. I moved out of that housing complex the next day, and when the campus police checked the archives, they found my laptop. And apparently, someone had used a heat source to melt part of it in the center of the screen, right where my face would have been reflecting. He wasn't a researcher, I'm pretty sure of that. In fact, the university had no record of him at all. I still get verification required pings on my phone at 3:15 in the morning sometimes, originating from unknown devices in my area. I had the tech guys check out my laptop and, apparently someone was sort of tracking me or something with some sort of method way above my pay grade, but they apparently fixed it and put security in, so I shouldn't have a problem anymore, but I don't go into that basement anymore, and I never, ever sit with my back to an open room if I can help it. The surveyor's report for the western edge of the Blackfoot River corridor in Montana mentioned a non-standard encroachment near the old timberline, but it didn't describe the physical sensation of the air in that valley. It was mid-November, the kind of cold that feels like it's trying to brittle your bones, and I was out there with my father-in-law. He's a retired land appraiser, and we were verifying the boundary markers for a private sale. The terrain is a punishing mix of deadfall and steep shale-covered slopes, and pretty precarious out there. We'd been working in silence for 3 hours when the environment began to feel just wrong. It started with the absence of bird noise, which is common enough in the cold, I suppose, but then the wind did something that was, sort of impossible. I could see the tops of the pines swaying violently to the east, but where we were standing, the air was dead still, not a needle moving. It was like we were standing in a pocket of some sort. "Check the compass," my father-in-law said. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a thicket of stunted spruce about 40 feet away. The needle wasn't spinning. That's the movie trope, right? Instead, it was sort of dragging. It moved sluggishly as if the housing were filled with oil instead of air, sticking to the western heading no matter how I rotated the base. Suddenly, though, as I was looking at the spinning, I saw movement in the spruce. It wasn't a hunter. A person in that brush would have made sound for sure. This was almost a silent vertical shift. A man stepped out from behind the trunk of a tree, though, that was way too thin for him to have hidden behind it. He was wearing a heavy charcoal-colored overcoat, completely impractical for the Montana backcountry, and a pair of leather dress shoes that were polished to mirror shine, despite the mud and the snow. He didn't have a backpack. He was carrying a long wooden surveyor's rod that looked like it dated back to the 1800s. He didn't acknowledge us. He walked to the patch of bare dirt, planted the rod, and began performing a series of rapid rhythmic measurements, but he wasn't looking at the rod's increments. He was looking at us through a brass transit level as he held his eye with a trembling hand. "Afternoon," my father-in-law called out, his voice sounding flat and muffled in this stagnant air now. The man stopped. He didn't turn his head. He reached into his overcoat and pulled out a heavy cast-iron bell. It was exactly the kind that you would see at an old schoolhouse desk. He didn't ring it. He held it by the clapper and began to scrape on the rim of the bell with a jagged piece of flint. The sound was eerie, a high-pitched metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't a random noise, too. It was a sequence, long scrapes followed by short, aggressive stabs. As he scraped, he began to walk toward us, though. He didn't navigate the deadfall, he just stepped over waist-high logs with a stride that looked mechanically elongated almost, his legs moving in a way that didn't seem human. Back to the truck, my father-in-law whispered, his hand gripping my shoulder hard enough to bruise it. We backed away, keeping our eyes on this guy. The man didn't follow us directly. He stayed parallel to us, moving through the dense brush with that same horrifying silent fluidness, the flint continuing to shriek against the iron bell the whole way. The timing mismatch happened as we reached the clearing where we had parked the Jeep. I looked at my watch. It was 2:14 p.m. I looked at the sky and the sun was touching the horizon. In the 15 minutes that it had taken us to walk back, we had lost nearly 3 hours of daylight, I think. We scrambled back into the Jeep, my father-in-law fumbling the keys, and for a second the engine wouldn't turn on. In the side mirror, I saw the man standing at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't scraping the bell anymore. He had set that on the ground, I think, and was stacking heavy river stones on top of it, faster than a person even should be able to move. He finished the pile, and it came up to waist height, just as the engine caught. As we tore down the Forest Service road, I looked back, and when I did, the clearing was empty. No man, no stones, just the flat grey light of the Montana evening. When we got back to the house, my father-in-law went straight to the mudroom to take off his boots, and he stopped dead. He just said to me that we were never to speak of this to anyone, or even to each other, ever again. When we set our boots down, we then realized that the tread was gone. Not worn down, but literally filed flat. Both pairs of our rugged hiking boots had been perfectly smoothed out, which is really weird, right? Honestly, it was almost like somebody just sat them through a sander for a few hours and they were just glossy flat. We never filed a report. I mean, there's no box for anything like this, right? But every year on the anniversary of that trip, I often think about that day and I get a cold chill down my spine every time that I do. I'm sharing this because, well, the local authorities here in Oklahoma basically treated it like a domestic disturbance or a prank. But the physical evidence doesn't lie. We still have structural damage to the house, and the missing time on the analog clock in the hallway is something that I still cannot wrap my head around. So my brother-in-law is a former diesel mechanic. He's a practical sort of no-nonsense guy who doesn't spook easily. And last Tuesday, he was staying at our place, a renovated 1940s farmhouse, while his apartment was being fumigated. Around 3:15, I woke up to the sound of a heavy oak pocket door in the hallway sliding open. It has a very specific metallic grind that you can hear from any room. I walked out into the hall, expecting to see him heading for the kitchen, but instead I saw him standing perfectly still, staring at the pantry door, and he looked pale. He told me that he had been standing there for a few minutes because apparently he had seen a man, not a shadow but a solid person in a heavy yellow industrial raincoat, walk into the pantry and close the door. Now, I checked the handle. It was locked from the inside, which doesn't make any sense because that door only has a simple latch on the outside. We actually had to use a screwdriver to pop the pins on the hinges in the end to get it open without breaking it. When the doors finally came away as well, the pantry was empty. There's no window in there, no crawl space access, but the shelves seem to have been touched for sure, because everything, the cans, the jars, the boxes, had been turned so that the labels faced the back of the shelf. The next night, I stayed up a little bit spooked by that. I didn't sit in the dark. I turned on every light in the house, but I was awake. Around 3 in the morning, the house suddenly felt off a little bit. Hard to explain, but it just felt like I was being watched. Anyway, I went to the kitchen and I found our cat. He was backed into a corner, staring at the refrigerator. I realized then that the fridge had been moved. Not just shifted, but slid about 4 inches to the left. You could even see the dust outline. I tried to push it back, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was bolted to the floor all of a sudden. I checked the back door and it was dead bolted, but the brass was burning hot to touch for some reason. When I looked through the peephole, I didn't see the porch light. Instead, I saw what looked like a shifting, oily black mass pressed against the glass. I don't think it was a person. It was more like a black fog that seemed to absorb the light from the yard almost. It moved with a slow, heavy rhythm, almost like it was breathing. Then I heard a sound coming from the basement. It wasn't a bang or a crash, but it was the sound of like metal on metal or something, like somebody was taking a pair of pliers to the copper pipes. I went down there to the basement with a heavy mag light. The air down there was absolutely freezing too, easily 20 degrees colder than the rest of the house. I checked the main water line, and that's when my stomach dropped. The copper pipe hadn't been broken, but it definitely had been crimped. Every few inches, the metal had been pinched shut by something with incredible strength, leaving what looked like small serrated teeth marks in the pipe. As I stood there looking at this, wondering how the heck this even happened, I heard the front door, the one that I had double bolted, slowly clicking open and then slam shut. I ran back upstairs, but the house was silent. My wife and the dogs were still asleep, which was probably the most unsettling part, to be honest. Usually the dogs bark if a leaf hits the window, but they weren't asleep so deep that it looked like they were sedated almost. I tried to wake my wife, but she just mumbled something and wouldn't open her eyes. I didn't wait any longer. I carried the dogs to the car and got my wife out of the house. We then sat in the driveway with the engine running until the sun came up. From the car, I watched the upstairs windows that night. There was nobody in the rooms from what I could tell. When we finally went back the next morning to get our essentials, the house was quiet. The pipes in the basement, they were definitely still crimped, and the fridge was still shifted, but the detail that made us leave for good, that was in the kitchen. So on the hardwood floor, right where I had been standing when I noticed the fridge had moved, someone had driven dozens of silver industrial staples into the wood. They weren't in a random pattern. They formed a perfect 1-for-1 scale outline of my feet, it seemed. The last thing that I found, too, was a small yellow plastic button on the floor of the pantry. I didn't pick it up, though. I just left it there and I locked the door. We're staying with family now, and I checked my phone's GPS logs from that night, and the data is an absolute mess. It shows my phone moving in a perfect high-speed circle around the property for 3 hours straight, even though I was sitting in a stationary car the whole time. I went to an optometrist yesterday because my left eye has been really irritated lately, and he found a microscopic silver splinter embedded in the surface of my cornea. And I kid you not, he said that it looked like a fragment of a staple. He removed it, but my vision in that eye is still pretty off, and everything looks slightly sharper and more sort of geometric, I guess, but it's almost like I'm seeing the framework of the room instead of the room itself. It's weird and really annoying, and apparently it's going to go away soon, but still, what a mess, right? Anyway, we're definitely not going back to that place, because whatever is in that house, it wasn't just an intruder. It's something else, and I don't want to deal with that. I've been trying to wrap my head around this for 6 months now, and I'm finally sharing this because I need to know if anyone with a background in acoustics or spatial geometry has encountered anything similar to this. So I'm a 28-year-old surveyor working out of Melbourne, and my entire job revolves around precise tracking, mapping, and reading terrain features. I don't believe in ghosts, and I have zero history of psychological issues. But what happened to my group in the Grampians last October completely shattered my understanding of, environmental baselines. 6 of us, myself, my partner, and 4 close friends, headed out for a routine 2-night trek. We picked an established backcountry clearing. It wasn't completely isolated. Another camping ground was pitched roughly 70 meters to our north, which gave the site a completely normal sort of recreational feel, I guess you could say. But we had our tents up by mid-afternoon, took some photos, and everything felt pretty good. The first indication that something was off came from Sarah. She's an experienced bushwalker, but early on she pointed toward a specific dense stand of stringy bark trees right on our eastern perimeter, and she kept insisting that the space looked hollow or vacant in a way that defied the natural layout of the forest. We laughed it off as overthinking, and we just started cooking. By 7:45, we were sitting around the fire pit. The transition happened in a span of a single second, too. So if you spend any time in the Australian bush, you become sort of desensitized to the baseline ambient noise there. Crickets, cicadas, canopy movement, distant bird calls. All of it was instantaneously gone. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, too. It felt physical almost, like the pressure dropped over the clearing. Exactly like the atmospheric weight right before a severe electrical storm, really. Sarah went completely rigid, though. She didn't turn her head, but her voice dropped to a dead flat whisper. There's something tracking the southern boundary over there. We all froze. My partner tried to execute a slow, incremental glance out of the corner of his eye without shifting his torso. And that's when the disruptions began occurring simultaneously across 3 completely different vectors. So first, the audio tracking. The guy to my left whispered that he could hear a distinct rhythmic compression on the dry leaf litter. It wasn't random animal movements is what I'm trying to say. It was keeping a static distance of maybe 12 meters from the firelight, moving in a perfect uniform circle around us. Second, there was a structural breach. My friend pointed a trembling hand at her dome tent. The rainfly was zipped completely shut from the outside, but we could see the nylon stretching outward from the interior. It looked exactly like a solid physical hand was pressing deliberately into the fabric from the inside, shifting around in the dark interior. But nobody had been near that tent for at least an hour now. Third, there was the biological reaction. The guy sitting directly across from us flinched violently and grabbed his forearm. He later described it as feeling a sudden charge of like high-voltage static electricity snapping against his sleeve. Eventually, when he pulled his cuff up under the firelight, there were 3 perfectly straight parallel cuts, and they were now weeping blood. His heavy canvas jacket was entirely unmarked, though, which was odd. Pure hyperventilating panic set in at this point. One of the girls was completely catatonic, staring into the embers, while another started crying. My partner gripped my hand so hard that his knuckles turned white, asking me if I could decipher the sounds coming from the dark. I couldn't hear explicit words, but the terror radiating from him proved that I wasn't just hearing things. I reached down to grab my keys out of my backpack at this point, and we didn't analyze anything else. 2 of us had our keys on us, so we made an immediate sort of non-verbal decision to just abandon the layout. We left the tents there, the gear, everything, the fire burning, we didn't care. We just threw everything on us into the 4-wheel drives and we cleared the logging track at high speed, hitting the nearest regional town only an hour later, which really should have taken us about an hour and a half, I would say. We returned the following morning under full daylight to salvage what was left of our equipment. The clearing was completely normal, though. The tents were untouched, our supplies were exactly where we left them, and there were 0 tracks or depressions in the damp clay that we could see. The camping party 70 meters away from us had already vanished. And look, you can argue group hysteria or environmental gas pockets all you want, but I know what we experienced that night, and it wasn't normal. Sarah, she completely refuses to camp anywhere bush heavy now, and she's the most rational person that I really know. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just gas pockets or animals or anything. It was something completely out of this world. I know exactly how insane this sounds, and if it was just me who experienced it, I would have blamed it on being exhausted, mishearing things, or just my brain playing tricks on me in the dark. But the fact that 2 other people caught it too, including a friend who was miles away on a call, is the only reason why I'm sharing this now. I need to know if anyone else has dealt with something like this before and what you did about it. So this happened late last August. I'm 22 and live with my parents and 2 younger siblings in a standard 2-story house just outside of Columbus, Ohio. The setup is pretty typical. All of our bedrooms are lined up along one long hallway upstairs, and my parents' room is directly downstairs on the first floor. We've had minor, totally explainable things sort of happen over the years, like doors drifting open if they're not latched right, or wood clicking when the temperature shifts, but nothing that ever really made me feel unsafe at all. It was right around midnight though, maybe a few minutes past, and I was sitting at my desk on a late-night video call with a friend from college. We were just shooting the breeze and looking over some projects, so I was completely awake and alert. And while we were talking, I heard a distinct rustling sound coming from my 14-year-old sister's bedroom across the hall. It sounded like someone shuffling around or brushing up against the wooden furniture in there. She used to sleepwalk a lot when she was a kid, so my first reaction was that she was just having an episode or whatever. I told my friend to hold on for a second, muted my mic, and stepped out into the hallway to check on her. And the second that I crossed the threshold of my room, I just felt awful. The hallway felt freezing all of a sudden compared to my bedroom too. It wasn't like a window was open or anything. It was just like this sudden heavy pocket of cold air was sitting right there in the middle of the corridor. As I walked closer to her door though, the shuffling sound inside her room stopped completely. I reached my hand out for her doorknob, and before my fingers could even touch the brass, a voice spoke right behind my ear. Now, this wasn't just a faint whisper, and it wasn't some muffled noise from the outside. It was a normal, clear, adult female voice speaking at a completely normal volume, barely inches away from the back of my neck. It just said, "What are you doing?" The tone was what messed me up the most, though. It wasn't scary or monstrous or anything, it just sounded incredibly cold and sharp, like a strict teacher catching you doing something that you weren't supposed to be doing. I whipped around instantly, expecting to find my younger brother trying to prank me or my sister standing behind me, but the hallway, it was completely empty. The air was dead still, and both of their bedroom doors were shut. A massive wave of just like pure adrenaline hit me all of a sudden. I didn't bother checking their rooms. I just turned around, walked fast down the stairs, and went straight for the first living room where all the lights were on. I then went to unmute my laptop, but I realized that I hadn't muted it at all, and I sat there trying to get my breathing under control. My friend was staring at the camera, looking totally confused, and asked me what happened. I asked her straight up, "Did you say something, or was there some weird audio feedback on your end?" She looked at me funny and said, "No, why?" "I thought someone walked into your room. I heard a woman ask what you were doing right before you walked away from the screen." That was the exact moment that my stomach dropped. Hearing it myself was one thing, but knowing that my microphone had actually picked up the sound wave, digitized it, and blasted it through my friend's speaker miles away meant that it was definitely not just in my head. It was a real physical sound. While I was sitting on the couch trying to process all of this though, Both of my siblings came downstairs looking exhausted and really annoyed. They then asked me why I was stomping around in the hallway and making so much noise. They had both been fast asleep until like a minute ago, and neither of them had opened their doors. Right as they said that, though, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mum, sent from her bedroom directly below the hallway. It just read, "Keep it down up there. People are trying to sleep." I was too freaked out to explain it over text, so I just replied with a quick joke saying that something weird just happened and that I'll tell her in the morning. She didn't text back, so I assumed she went right back to sleep. But the next morning at breakfast is when the pieces lined up in a way that really gives me chills just thinking about it. So my mum, she brought up the texting incident. She told me that she originally woke up at like 12:12 a.m. because she heard my footsteps pacing back and forth above her head, which is when she sent the text. She closed her eyes and was just starting to drift off again a few minutes later. She suddenly woke up because she felt a physical draft right against her face, like someone was leaning over the bed, breathing on her. Before she could even open her eyes or turn to my dad, apparently she heard a woman's voice whisper directly into her ear, "Help me." She said that it was the exact same profile that I described. Clear, direct, an unfamiliar female voice, and close enough that it felt like the person was practically touching her. She bolted upright, turned on the bedside lamp and checked the room. My dad was dead to the world beside her like he normally is. The bedroom door was locked tight though, and nothing was out of place. What really freaked her out though was when she grabbed her phone to check the time right after hearing the voice. My text message was about something weird happening upstairs, and it was sitting on her screen, time-stamped at that exact same minute. We sat at the kitchen table and compared notes for about an hour after that. Two identical, clear female voices had manifested in two completely different parts of the house within a 3-minute window, specifically targeting the only two people who were awake at that time, while completely bypassing my siblings and my dad. How weird is that, right? Well, since that night, nothing like that has happened again, thankfully. No voices at least, but whenever I have to walk down the upstairs hallway after midnight, I always get this horrible, heavy feeling right outside of my sister's bedroom door, like someone is standing just a fraction of an inch outside of my field of vision. It's really creepy and absolutely freaks me out. I've started keeping my bedroom door completely shut and latched every single night now, which is something that I never used to do. I'm still trying to find a logical explanation for how an audio glitch hits a house like that, but having my friend hear it over a video call is the one detail that I just cannot break down. Has anyone else here ever experienced anything like this before, where a sound followed you or hit multiple people in different rooms at the same time or something like that? If you have, do let me know because I am losing my mind trying to rationalize all of this. I'm 24 now, out of college, and I still get a pit in my stomach whenever I think about the last night of that trip. So back in the fall of 2018, when I was 16 years old, I was a part of a high school leadership program. It wasn't a survival camp or anything crazy like that, just a 4-day backpacking trip through a state park up in the damp, heavily forested mountains of western Oregon. It was late October, meaning that the sun dropped like a stone by about 5 p.m, and the weather was absolutely miserable, non-stop freezing rain and just mud everywhere. There were 8 of us kids, plus 2 instructors though, and on our final night, we set up camp in a clearing right on the edge of a dense pine forest. It felt completely cut off from everything. No cell service, no bars, nothing. About a quarter of a mile down a dirt trail from our tents, there was an old park utility building. It was one of those sort of concrete public restrooms that barely gets maintained, flickering fluorescent tubes, peeling paint and smelling like damp earth. I went down there alone right before we all turned in for the night, and by then it was pretty much pitch black, and the only light was the beam from my headlamp and the dull yellow glow humming inside of the restroom. But I went in, washed my face at the sink, and was leaning over to dry off when the electrical hand dryer on the opposite wall slammed on by itself. I almost had a heart attack because it was so loud, but it wasn't one of those new sort of hypersensitive ones. It was just an old metal box with a mechanical button. I was standing about 10 feet away from it, just sort of staring at it, my heart doing a little bit of a flutter, trying to convince myself that a moth or maybe something had flown past the sensor. And after about 10 seconds, it cut out. The silence that followed felt incredibly heavy. I grabbed my pack to leave, and the second that I reached for the heavy wooden exit door, the handle started shaking. It wasn't a violent rattle, but sort of a firm, deliberate jiggling of the latch, like someone on the other side was trying to open it but couldn't get a grip. My first thought was that one of the guys from camp had followed me down to scare me or something, so I yanked the door open instantly to catch them in the act, but when I did, there was no one there. I looked down the trail and saw the faint bobbing beams of flashlights way up ahead near our campsite. I figured that they must have just knocked on the door and run off, but it left a really sour taste in my mouth. I clicked my headlamp onto high beam and I started walking back. The trail was pretty tight, flanked by open clearing on my right and thick black pines on my left. A couple of minutes into the walk, that primal instinct kicked in again, the absolute certainty that you're being watched. My neck got hot and my stomach dropped. Then, I heard something heavy break a branch in the tree line to my left. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound stopped too. I took 4 quick steps forward. Whatever it was took 4 steps with me, keeping pace just 15 feet inside the dark brush. At that point, a massive spike of adrenaline suddenly hit me. I didn't run, but I started power walking as fast as my boots could move, and right as I hit the halfway mark back to camp, I heard this sort of low, wet whistling sound coming from the dark trees. It sort of sounded like air being forced through a narrow throat, not like a bear or a deer or a cougar or anything. I'd heard all of these before, but I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, and I didn't look back until I burst into the firelight of our camp. And when I got back, the mood was already completely ruined. Everyone was standing around looking really freaked out. While I was at the bathroom, apparently someone had gone through the site. Tent zippers were pulled wide open, sleeping bags were unrolled, and freeze-dried meals had been pulled out of packs and scattered all over the logs. Nothing was stolen, but they were just targeted and sort of messed with. One of the guys, a quiet kid named Tyler, mentioned that he thought that he had seen a tall figure walking between the tents a few minutes earlier, but he'd assumed that it was me returning from the restroom. I assured him that it wasn't, though. We were too exhausted to hike out in the dark, so stoked the fire pretty big and tried to talk ourselves down. Eventually, we crawled into our tents. I was sharing a 2-person dome tent with Tyler that night. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the fire had completely died down. The rain had stopped and the woods were pretty much dead quiet. I was sort of just laying there, listening to the wind and the crickets, when I heard a low sort of talking right outside of our rainfly. It was close enough that I could hear the wet cadence of the speech, though I couldn't quite make out what the specific words were. It sounded a bit like 2 of the guys in our group having a casual, hushed conversation just out of reach, and I reached over in the dark and nudged Tyler's shoulder. He woke up instantly, his body going totally rigid. He listened for 3 seconds and then whispered a tiny, trembling "yeah" into the dark. Right then, a wave of cold sweat broke across my forehead. The voice speaking right outside of our tent canvas, the tone, the pitch, the specific way it dragged out vowels, it was Tyler's voice. I mean, it sounded exactly like he was standing out there in the freezing mud talking to himself. But Tyler was literally 3 inches away from me in his sleeping bag, his chest heaving in absolute terror as we both listened, wide-eyed. We didn't move, though. We didn't unzip the tent. We just sort of laid there in the pitch black, paralyzed, listening to Tyler's voice mumbling nonsense syllables in the dark until it finally faded out into the trees at around 4 in the morning, I would say. Obviously, we didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the ground was too churned up from the rain to find any clear footprints. The instructors completely blew us off, claiming that it must have been local teenagers or another hiking group playing pranks, but we all knew that that was absolute garbage. I mean, there wasn't another soul permitted in that sector of the park for miles that weekend. Look, I'm a pretty rational guy. I know that there are people out there who live in the woods, and I can rationalize the hand dryer glitching and the tents being messed with, the footsteps on the trail, but I cannot logically break down that voice. I mean, hearing someone speak the exact vocal cords of the person shivering right next to you is something that I really don't know how to explain. I haven't gone camping since then, and I lost touch with those guys, but I often wonder if they still think about it, too. I'm 26 and work as an assistant manager at a regional distribution center just outside of a small rural town in western Pennsylvania. My property is on a long unpaved gravel road surrounded by thick woods on both sides. There are few neighbors, but the houses are spaced pretty far apart, so you don't get any random foot traffic or cars after dark here. It's the kind of place where it gets pitch black and incredibly quiet the second that the sun goes down. Because of my job, I work the late shift. I usually pull into my driveway somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight. The weird thing is that this only ever happens right after I get home and shut off my engine, never later in the night. The first time it happened, I didn't think too much of it. I got out of my truck, slammed the door, and immediately heard what sounded exactly like someone riding a bike down the gravel road. If you've ever heard bike tires on loose gravel, you know that it's a very specific rhythmic crunch that sounds nothing like asphalt. I figured that it was a local kid out late, which was a little bit odd for a Tuesday night, but whatever. But then, the sound didn't fade away. It passed right in front of my driveway, moving left to right, and about 10 seconds later, it sounded like it was passing by again. Same exact direction, same steady speed. It would start loud on the left, roll right past my mailbox, and fade out on the right, only to loop right back around to the start a few seconds later. There's no turnaround point anywhere near my property, though. You'd have to ride like a quarter of a mile down the road before you could even loop back. I stood there by the truck for a couple of minutes, just listening to it do laps in the dark, and I walked down to the edge of the ditch to see who it was. But there was no one there. There was no headlight, no reflector, no silhouette against the trees. It was just pitch black out there, and unless you had a flashlight, there's no way that you would be able to see the road at all, let alone ride a bike down a steady clip like that. I tried to tell myself that the sound was carrying weirdly through the valley here. Sometimes the acoustics out here get pretty warped and you can hear a tractor or maybe a highway miles away, like it's right next to you. So I just went inside. The next night, though, it happened again. Same time, same gravel crunch, same looping effect. This time, though, I stayed perfectly still against the side of my truck to track it. It didn't sound like an echo at all. The volume was completely consistent. Like whatever was making the noise was physically on the road right in front of me, maybe 30 feet away. Then I noticed a second sound layered into the crushing tires. There was breathing. It wasn't heavy panting like a person exerting themselves on a bike. It sounded like short, sharp bursts of air, almost like a large dog sniffing the ground and then doing that quick sort of forceful huff to clear its nose. It was perfectly in sync though with the rolling sound, repeating every few seconds as it passed by. That was the part that made my skin crawl, because I have a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix. He's incredibly protective and alert to absolutely everything outside. If a stray cat, a deer, or even a neighbor walking a block away catches his attention, he immediately goes into lockdown mode, growling, ears up, pacing the fence line. But right then, he didn't react at all. He was sitting right at my boots, completely relaxed, looking up at me like nothing was happening. He didn't perk his ears, he didn't sniff the air, nothing. I grabbed his collar and I brought him inside pretty quickly after that. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the environment whenever the sound started up. The biggest giveaway was just how dead silent the rest of the woods got too. And every night since then, it's just the gravel crunch and that weird sort of huffing breath. A few nights ago, I decided to try and catch whatever it was in the act as well. I left my headlights off when I pulled in, kept the garage light dark, and I stood just inside the threshold with the automatic garage door stopped halfway up. I waited, and within a minute, the sound started again. It didn't gradually approach from down the road this time, though. It was just suddenly there, right in front of my driveway. The crunching of the gravel sounded like it was barely 15 feet away from where I was crouching. I crept forward a few inches, squinting into the dark, trying to catch any sign of movement. But still, I didn't see anything. The second, though, that I hit the button to slam the garage door down, the sound cut out. It didn't fade into the distance, and it didn't speed up. It just vanished instantly, like someone hit a pause button. The most recent time it happened was last Friday, though. It was a clear night with a massive full moon, meaning that it was bright enough that I could see perfectly across the road and all the way into the first layer of the tree line even. I got out of my truck, let the dog out to pee, and there it was again, left to right, the steady crunch of tires on gravel and that huffing breath. But this time, alongside of the rolling sound, I could hear something moving through the high weeds just off the shoulder of the road. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but more like a heavy mass shifting through the brush, moving deliberately. I called my shepherd over and held him tight against my leg. Still, zero reaction though. He just wagged his tail and looked up at me, completely oblivious to the heavy rustling and the crunching happening right in his line of sight. If there was a real animal out there, like a bear, a coyote, or even a person really, his instincts would have blown up for sure. I stood there for about 20 seconds watching the empty moonlit road as the sound passed by again, before I lost my nerve, dragged the dog inside, and locked every deadbolt in the house. I've been racking my brain trying to find a normal explanation. Maybe it's a neighbor riding a night trail bike without lights for some bizarre reason, and the breathing is just an animal in the ditch that I've misidentified or something. But that still doesn't explain why I can't see a single thing, even under a bright full moon, and why the sound completely cuts out the moment that I shut the garage door, or why my dog doesn't react at all. I don't think that I'm dealing with a ghost or anything, but I do think that there's something incredibly wrong with how that sound behaves. I'm definitely not going to walk down the road at midnight to investigate or anything. At this point, the second that I hear that gravel start to crunch, I just get inside and I close the blinds. Whatever is out there, it clearly doesn't want to be seen, and quite honestly, I am fine keeping it that way. I keep running the whole thing over and over again in my head, trying to find a normal explanation that actually makes sense. My husband, our 8-year-old daughter, and I were spending the weekend up near the Delaware Water Gap in northern New Jersey. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, we decided to take a quick walk down one of the river trails. It's a semi-wooded public area, pretty popular during the summer. But since it was late spring and getting closer to the evening, the trail felt completely isolated. Everything was pretty normal too, until we hit a long straight stretch of dirt path that runs right alongside the riverbank. For absolutely no reason at all, the woods just went dead quiet. It was really sudden too, a noticeable drop in the sound. No birds, no wind in the trees, no insects buzzing. The only thing that you could hear was the flat rush of the river water. I was just starting to feel a little bit uneasy when my daughter stopped walking and pointed across the river. She said, "Look, Mum, that dog is swimming." My husband and I looked over, and there was definitely a large shape in the water, pulling itself up onto the muddy opposite bank. At first glance, I figured it was just a stray German Shepherd or maybe a big husky mix that had escaped from one of the properties nearby. But once it got completely out of the water and stood up on all fours, it didn't look like any normal dog that I'd ever seen. It was massive, way bigger than a standard pet, with incredibly long, lean legs and a patchy light grey coat that looked matted and really rough. It shook the water off its fur, turned its body toward us, and locked its eyes right onto our group. I don't mean it just glanced over because it heard us too. It completely zeroed in on us. It didn't blink, it didn't sniff the air, and it didn't shift its weight. It just stared across the water with this absolute intense focus. But my husband kind of let out a nervous chuckle and murmured, "Wow, what the heck is that thing?" But the laugh died in his throat pretty quickly. Our daughter, totally oblivious, started waving her arms at it like it was a friendly puppy at a park or something. By then, my adrenaline was already spiking. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, and wild animals, even feral dogs or coyotes, don't just stand out in the wide open like that, completely unafraid of 3 adults and a child screaming and waving. I told my husband then that we needed to start walking back immediately. As soon as we turned around and began moving down the trail, though, the thing started moving too. It didn't try to cross the river toward us. It stayed on its side of the bank, pacing us at the exact same speed that we were walking. And it never broke eye contact, not even for a split second. Even when it had to step over large rocks or push its way through thick briars or whatever, its head stayed completely locked onto us, angled sideways as it walked forward. It tracked us like that too for, I would say, at least a solid 3 or maybe 4 minutes. My daughter kept giggling and saying, "Look, it's playing a game with us." My husband grabbed her hand incredibly tight, pulled her close to his side and told her in a really sharp and serious voice to stop looking at it. I tried to keep my face completely blank so I wouldn't terrify her, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that my heart was practically jumping out of my chest. It was just the most unnatural thing I've ever seen, just being hunted by this silent grey shape across 50 feet of water like that. Eventually, the trail took a sharp curve away from the river and cut deeper into the thick woods, breaking our line of sight. And the very second that the river was out of view, the normal wood noises flooded back in. Crickets started chirping again, birds were making noises, and the heavy feeling in the air just sort of, was gone. We walked double time back to our car, and we immediately drove home. We didn't talk about it much that night, just sort of collectively brushed it off as a really large and creepy feral dog, because we wanted to forget about it, I think. And that really should have been the end of it. But the next morning, I woke up early around 6 in the morning to grab a coffee and sit out the back porch before getting ready for work. We live in a pretty rural neighborhood about 45 minutes away from that trail, with a decent-sized backyard that backs up to some woods there. It had rained a little bit right before dawn, so the dirt and the mulch along the side of our house was still soft and damp. And as I walked out, I noticed a line of deep marks in the mud near the foundation. I walked over to look, and my stomach dropped into a freezing knot. They were massive, and I mean massive paw prints, way larger than any domestic dog breed around here. The stride length was wide, spaced out like whatever made them was taking huge, long, slow, deliberate steps. But the part that makes me feel sick every time that I think about it is where the tracks ended. The prints, they walked right out of the tree line, came straight across the grass, and stopped directly underneath our low-set living room window. There were also 2 deep indents in the mud right up against the vinyl siding there, like it had stood up on its hind legs to press itself against the glass or something. And then the trail literally just stopped. There were no turning tracks, no prints double backing into the grass, no muddy slides showing that it had jumped or run away or anything. The footprints literally just went right up to the window, and then there was nothing else but undisturbed smooth mud, almost like it had just completely vanished in that spot. I called my husband out, and the second that he saw them, his face went completely pale. We ended up calling the local wildlife control office later that day, and the warden told us that there had been a few reports of a large coyote or a wolf hybrid or feral dog pack moving through the county lately, and that it was probably a hybrid that had lost its fear of humans because people leave garbage out all the time. He said that it probably followed our scent to our car, or it was just a bizarre coincidence that it hit our yard the next morning. And on paper, that sounds like a perfectly reasonable explanation, I suppose. But I have never, in my entire life, seen an animal act with that kind of cold, calculated intelligence like that. No wild dog tracks a family in broad daylight without making a sound, and no normal animal walks straight up to a specific window and just vanishes into thin air without leaving a single exit stride. We haven't seen grey things since that morning, but I've started checking the window locks 3 times every night before I go to bed now, because I'm not taking any chances with something that watches you like that. This actually happened just a few days ago, right around 3:30 in the afternoon. So I live in Austin, Texas, and I'd finished up a work shift early, so I drove down to a popular park right along Lady Bird Lake just to clear my head for a bit. It's a pretty busy spot, lots of people jogging and whatnot, folks walking their dogs, couples sitting on blankets. Nothing remote or creepy about it at all, really. I found an empty bench facing the water. I sat down for a bit and started scrolling through my phone. Now, to give you a bit of context here, I've been going through a bit of a rough patch lately. Nothing tragic, but just a lot of relationship stress and overthinking everything. Right before this happened, I'd actually just read an article online about relationship anxiety, and it hit so incredibly close to home that I took a quick screenshot of the text to save for later. I locked my phone, set it on my knee, and just stared out at the water. Maybe 2 minutes later, a voice spoke from my left. I didn't hear a single footstep approaching, which was the first detail that really felt weird, because the path right there is crushed gravel and you can always hear people walking up behind you. She just said, "Hey," in a really casual and sort of flat tone. I looked up, kind of startled, because I didn't think that she was talking to me at first. Without waiting for me to say a word, she just sat right down on the opposite end of the bench. The lack of personal space immediately made my guard go up, though. She looked to be in her mid-30s and had short dark hair, wore standard sunglasses, and had a small leather crossbody bag over her shoulder. She looked normal enough, I suppose, nothing obviously strange about her clothing or appearance or anything, but she didn't look around at the lake or the path at all. Her head was turned completely toward me, just watching me. Then she asked, "Hey, can I ask you something kind of random?" My stomach did a bit of a flip, but I just nodded and said, yeah, sure," because it's hard to say no to someone's face, right? Well, she leaned in slightly and then said, "What do you think love actually is?" She wasn't smiling. She didn't laugh like it was a joke, and she didn't have that friendly, making conversation vibe. It was a completely straight-dead serious question. The whole thing threw me totally out of balance, if I'm honest. I mean, it's not the kind of heavy philosophical question you expect from a random stranger on a park bench, right? I just sort of sat there like a deer in the headlights, my brain completely blanking out. I remember this intense, suffocating feeling of pressure washing over me, like she was waiting for me to say one specific phrase. I just muttered in the end, I don't really know, just to shut the conversation down. Right then, though, she reached up and took her sunglasses off, and this is the part that completely ruined the interaction for me. Her eyes, they didn't quite line up properly. It wasn't an obvious extreme medical condition or anything, but just a sort of slight subtle misalignment that made making direct eye contact really uncomfortable. It honestly felt a little bit intentional too, like her gaze was purposefully shifting around to study my micro-reactions. Then she said, completely calmly and unbothered, "You're focusing on the wrong part of it. You'll figure it out, though." No smile, no warmth. She just said that as a cold fact. I then felt really weird about the whole situation and asked her, "What do you mean by that?" She ignored my question completely. She just slid her sunglasses back over her eyes, stood up from the bench and said, "You're not as alone as you think." Then she turned and walked off at a really brisk pace toward a dirt trail that cuts into a heavily wooded, shaded section of the park. The entire encounter couldn't have lasted more than 60 seconds. I sat on that bench for a good 5 minutes, just trying to process what the heck had just happened, because the energy of the whole thing felt incredibly wrong. I mean, it wasn't an overt physical threat or anything, but it was just so deeply, weirdly invasive. Out of pure curiosity, I would say, I finally got up and walked down the same wooded path that she had taken. The trail, it isn't very long, and it opens up pretty quickly into 2 wide, clear grassy fields. If someone was walking down there, you'd be able to spot them from hundreds of yards away very easily. But when I got there, she was completely gone. I didn't see anyone matching her description. No one walking away in the distance, nothing. There were still other people hanging out in the park, so it's not like the area had suddenly cleared out or anything too. I even walked a full loop around the entire sector of the trail just to make sure that she hadn't stopped behind a tree or something, but nothing. There was no one there. I tried to shake it off though, assumed that she must have just been walking faster than me or cut through the brush when I wasn't looking, and I drove home. I completely forgot about the whole thing too, until later that night, and that's when things took a turn that genuinely made my blood run cold. You see, I opened my phone's photo gallery to send that relationship screenshot to a close friend of mine, and it wasn't there anymore. I checked my main camera roll, my hidden folder, and my recently deleted album. The image was completely gone, like it had never even been captured. And in its place, I think, was a picture of this woman's face staring directly at me. It was as if I had taken a photo of her looking directly at me with those creepy eyes of her. Look, I'm trying to keep both feet on the ground here, and it could easily just be a digital glitch, or maybe I hit the home button before the screenshot actually saved to my drive or whatever, and maybe that's how I lost that first image. But how that second image appeared on my phone, I genuinely have no idea. Also, when I think back about it, the one thing that I really cannot logically dissolve is the fact that she chose that exact 2-minute window to sit down next to me and ask a question perfectly mirrored to the exact sentence that I'm pretty sure I remember reading on my screen, and telling me that apparently I was focusing on the wrong part of it or something. Anyway, I haven't gone back to that park since then, and if anyone out there has had a stranger approach them with the same sort of bizarre hyper-focused energy like this, and then a picture of them randomly appears on your phone, I would really like to know, because I'm losing my mind trying to rationalize how she knew exactly what I was thinking, what I was looking at, and how on earth she even got onto my phone. Right after things started opening up after COVID, my fiance and I moved into a townhouse just outside of Savannah, Georgia. The rental market was a total nightmare, so we took the first place that we could find that allowed pets. It was an odd location, sandwiched directly between a small, historic local cemetery on the left side and a sluggish tidal river running right behind the back deck. At the time, we didn't care about the graveyard. We just assumed that it meant that the neighbors would be quiet for once. Before we signed the lease, though, I did 2 walkthroughs with our black lab. He didn't growl, his hair didn't stand up, and I didn't get any weird vibe or instinctual do not live here warnings. So we moved our stuff in around late May. For the first few months, everything was pretty normal too. Just standard house settling noises. The actual shift started in November, about a week after Halloween. Now, my fiancé was looking for a spot to store some extra suitcases under the main staircase and found a hidden crawl space panel that I didn't even know was there. It wasn't a standard door as well, just a piece of drywall that you had to physically lift out of the frame. The second, though, that he popped it open, I just got this horrible, overwhelming wave of anxiety and told him to leave it alone. He laughed and told me that I was being dramatic, and crawled inside with a flashlight anyway. He found a small, unfinished underground room. Dirt floor, old stone foundation walls, maybe the size of about a tool shed. Leaning against the back wall was an old canvas painting. It didn't have a frame, just a raw canvas showing a single dead, leafless tree on the top of a hill at night. I told him to leave the painting there, and to find somewhere else for the suitcases. He ignored me though, stashed our summer gear in the dirt room, and actually carried the painting upstairs to lean it against the living room wall. I was furious with him, not because I thought that it was haunted or anything, but just because it was old, dusty, and creepy to look at. I made him take it back downstairs the next morning. Within 48 hours, I would say, the house completely changed after this. One evening, we went out to grab some Mexican food. I specifically turned on the downstairs hallway light before we looked up so that the animals wouldn't be in the dark. When we unlocked the front door an hour later, the light was off. Not burned out and not flickering, but the physical plastic switch had been flipped down into the off position. We both just sort of stood there in the dark, debating whether we had actually forgotten to flip it, but I knew for a fact that I had turned it on for sure. The layout of the second floor is important here too. There's a long straight hallway upstairs, and our master bedroom was on the far end of this, facing the river, and my home office was at the opposite end. Its window looks directly down into the cemetery there, and my fiancé hated the energy in that office, so we usually kept that door completely shut. A few days later, I was working at my desk when my cat knocked a water glass onto the hardwood floor, shattering it. I swept it all up, dumped the broken shards into the small trash can in the upstairs bathroom, and I went back to work. Later that night, around 10 p.m, we were downstairs watching TV, and I got up to head upstairs to grab a sweatshirt from the bedroom. Right before my foot hit the bottom step, though, this overwhelming alarm bell went off in my head. I literally stopped dead and reached out to flip on the stairway light, and the middle 3 steps were now covered in jagged shards of broken glass. And I mean, it wasn't just a stray piece here or there, it was a full deliberate pile. If I had walked up in the dark, I would have sliced my foot open for sure. I ran upstairs, checked the bathroom trash can, and the glass that I had swept up earlier was still inside. The bin hadn't tipped, and nobody had been upstairs all evening. There was no earthly way, though, for that glass to migrate down to the stairs on its own like that. After that, things got incredibly loud and visible too. We started seeing these tiny floating points of light drift across the living room ceiling at night. The cat would actually sit up, track them with his eyes, and even try to pounce on them. I tried to tell myself that it was just headlights reflecting from the road, but they moved in really erratic, closed patterns that didn't match any external light source. A week later, I watched a heavy-hanging plant decoration in the corner of the room swing so violently that it smacked the cat while he was sleeping underneath it. Mind you, the air in the house was dead still. No AC running, windows were locked, no fans on, and even if they were, this thing was swinging so hard that it still wouldn't have made sense. The bottom tassel moved like someone had walked up to it and yanked it with their hand. Then came the incident at 3:30 in the morning that finally broke my fiance's skepticism. So we were fast asleep when a massive metallic crash echoed from our office down the hall. My fiance grabbed his handgun, it was that loud, and we ran to the room. I had a heavy metal storage rack in there that we sort of kept our outdoor gear in at this point, and hanging from the top bar was a heavy-duty locking climbing carabiner holding about 15 pounds of ropes and harnesses. If you know anything about climbing gear, these carabiners require a deliberate manual twist and sort of push action to open them. They physically cannot slip off a bar, but the entire bundle was scattered across the floor. The carabiner was also wide open and completely unhooked. My fiance was convinced that somebody was in the house. He did a full tactical sweep of every closet, the attic, and even ran out into the yard with a flashlight. While I was outside checking the perimeter, I was standing alone in our bedroom. Suddenly, 3 sharp, heavy knuckles slammed against the exterior bedroom wall. That wall is on the second story, completely smooth siding, hovering 20 feet over the riverbank, with zero balcony or ladder access at all. When my fiance came back inside, I was shaking so hard that I couldn't even speak. That was the night, too, that he finally admitted that something was seriously wrong with this place. Next came the voices. We started hearing what sounded like 2 people having a low, intense conversation in the far corner of our bedroom late at night. It wasn't an ambient murmur or anything, though. It had the distinct rhythmic back-and-forth cadence of a man and a woman talking. We couldn't make out the specific words, but the structure of the conversation was clear as day. We checked the crawl space again, and we even had a contractor neighbor come over to check our shared walls for any weird plumbing or wiring echoes or anything. But in the end, he couldn't find anything. The only adjacent neighbor that we had was a sweet 80-year-old widow who lived completely alone, and honestly, I just don't think that she would have been even capable of doing that. Then, the physical toll started. I began suffering from, horrific sleep paralysis almost every night. I'd wake up completely pinned to the mattress, unable to draw breath, trying to scream, but only making a muffled choking sound. One night, too, during one of those episodes, I managed to open my eyes, and there was a pitch-black human-shaped shadow standing at the foot of our bed. Its limbs were completely out of proportion, way too long and thin, and it was slowly crawling up over our blankets, straight toward my face. Right then, too, my fiancé jolted awake, screamed, and started violently throwing his arms out, trying to physically shove something off of the bottom of the bed. He described seeing the exact same elongated dark mass that I had seen. Comparing notes afterward was terrifying because it proved that it wasn't just a solo hallucination as I was thinking at the time. I started sleeping on the downstairs couch after that, but it really didn't fix anything. We still heard the conversations upstairs. The lights kept doing things that they shouldn't. I actually emailed a local church asking if someone could come out and bless the house, even though I don't believe in any of that stuff. They replied a couple of days later saying that they don't do home visitations unless you're a registered member of their parish, which was incredibly disheartening. That same week, though, while I was on a phone call with my mum describing how bad things had gotten, The light bulb in my office started violently flickering and popping until it blew out completely. And look, that may have just been a bulb problem or whatever, but still, after you've been through all of this, everything in that house seemed weird. By the end of it, everyone in the house was physically sick. The cat developed severe stress-induced urinary blockages that cost us thousands in vet bills. Our lab became totally lethargic, hiding under the kitchen table and refusing to go outside. My fiancé ended up in the ER for a sudden severe case of vertigo that left him unable to walk straight. And my own chronic health issues flared up worse than they had in at least a decade. We lasted just over a year before we broke the lease, packed up our stuff, and moved into a regular suburban apartment further inland. The absolute second, and I mean the second, that we crossed the threshold of the new place, everything stopped. No more voices, no more sleep paralysis, no more flying objects. The animals completely recovered within a month, and the cat hasn't had a single health issue since then. I've spent a lot of time trying to look at this all rationally. Mold, carbon monoxide, extreme sleep deprivation, or just a massive cluster of bad coincidences can do crazy things to your mind, I know that. We checked for all of that though. The meters at the time, they came back clean. We didn't have any mold issues that we could ever find. We had people come in and check all of this too. And as far as I can really tell, everything in that house was completely fine until that crawl space was opened, and that dead tree painting was brought into our living space. We're safe now, thankfully, but I will never, ever live near a river or a graveyard for as long as I live. I grew up in a very religious LDS household in Alberta, Canada. My grandmother was extremely devout, and before she passed, she said something to my mum that has always stuck with the family for years. I was too young to fully understand it at the time, but the way that it was repeated later made it sound like she sort of believed that she was being warned about something following the family line or something like that. That created a kind of a baseline fear in my childhood that I didn't really question until much later. As a kid, strange things in our home were treated as pretty normal. We had house blessings done more than once. Doors would open or close on their own. We'd hear footsteps upstairs when nobody was there. Things like that. My parents, they always framed it as spiritual interference or tests, so I grew up assuming that this was just sort of a part of life. I didn't really question it as well until I got older and I met my husband, who grew up completely outside of any religious system. He had never experienced anything like that before meeting me, which already made me start separating what might have been coincidence from what I was being taught to interpret as spiritual events. One thing that stood out was something that my sister told me when we were teenagers. She said that she would sometimes experience sleep paralysis, but only on nights that she read scripture before bed. She described waking up unable to move and feeling pressure on her chest. She eventually stopped reading at night because she felt that it was triggering these episodes. At the time, my mother explained it as spiritual resistance increasing when you were trying to do the right thing. That explanation, though, never fully sat right with me, but I didn't have an alternative framework for it, so I just sort of accepted it. Over the years, there were other incidents, though. Objects moving, unexplainable noises, and one situation where a room in my parents' house was found in disarray with no clear cause. I don't have a clean explanation for any of these, obviously, but I also cannot affirm anything beyond what I personally saw or heard. The most intense experience that I had before marriage happened at my grandparents' house. They were very strict about their beliefs and lived in a fairly isolated rural home. I was staying overnight in a guest room upstairs. In the middle of the night, I woke up to what sounded like someone moving around inside of the room. Not just a single sound too, but pacing and circling like footsteps crossing the floor repeatedly. I stayed still for a while, assuming that it was maybe someone in the hallway, but it didn't quite match the pattern of a normal movement. After a while, I left the room and I went downstairs to my parents, and when I told them in the morning, they dismissed it as me being overtired. I didn't push back at the time, but I remember being very unsettled because the house was supposed to be one of the safest places in terms of their beliefs. Another incident happened a few years later at a different property that my grandparents owned, a small condo that hadn't been used in weeks. My dad and I arrived there late one night to check on it. The back door was open when we got there, which immediately felt off because there was no reason for it to be unlocked or left that way. We checked the rooms though, and we didn't find anything unusual until we went into the bathroom. Now, there's a mirror directly opposite the doorway, and when my dad and I looked into it at the same time, he suddenly reacted and sort of stepped back. For a moment, his face looked uneven or sort of distorted, specifically on one side, like the muscles weren't responding normally. It only lasted maybe a second or two, but it was enough that both of us reacted strongly. After that, he insisted that we do a blessing on the property and didn't want to stay any longer than necessary. When I got married, my husband and I had a few more incidences together. Things like shadows appearing briefly in doorways or peripheral vision, and one situation where he thought that I was in a different room that I actually was because he saw someone matching my shape moving in the hallway. At another point, while staying at his parents' house, there were loud footsteps on the roof even. We went outside with his father and we couldn't find anything that could explain it. The next day, his parents mentioned hearing similar noises that same night, which made the situation more confusing because multiple people independently heard this. Things changed again when I became pregnant with my first child. Around that time, I started having very vivid and emotionally intense dreams. I wouldn't call them traditional nightmares at first, but they became more consistent and harder to distinguish from normal sleep. One night I had a sequence of dreams where I repeatedly woke up in different locations from my past. In each one, I was in a familiar room from a previous house, and each time there was a dark, human-shaped figure present somewhere in that space. It wasn't chasing me or interacting directly, just present in a way that felt observant, I guess. I remember the repeated feeling of trying to wake up properly and then finding myself in another vision of a place that I had lived before. Eventually, though, I actually woke up in my own bedroom, but the transition felt abrupt and really disorienting. I was extremely distressed and had a strong physical reaction to this. My husband woke up because of how I was reacting, and it took a long time to fully calm down afterward. I avoided sleep for a while after that because I didn't want to experience anything similar again. Over time, something else that I noticed was that my perception of these events seemed to shift depending on how stressed or emotionally overwhelmed I was. There were periods where nothing unusual happened for months, and other periods where things felt more intense and harder to dismiss. At some point, my husband and I both left the church. After that transition, the frequency of those experiences significantly decreased. Now, I don't claim that there was a direct causal link, but what I can say is that I can report that the pattern as I experienced it was broken. More recently, though, I came across online discussions about religious rituals and interpretations of them, including baptisms for the dead. Some of the language people used around it reframed it in a way that I hadn't considered before, and that triggered a lot of reflection and anxiety on my own part. I'm aware that online explanations can be speculative or exaggerated, but it did make me reevaluate how I previously interpreted certain beliefs and experiences. Right now, I'm not saying that I have definitive explanations for any of this. I also recognize that memory, fear, and sleep disruption, and even suggestion, can all affect how events are perceived and recalled over time. What I can say is that during that period of my life, I consistently experienced things that I just cannot easily explain within a normal framework, and they were strongly tied to my environment and mental state at the time, I think. Since leaving that environment, those experiences have, well, pretty much largely stopped, which I am extremely thankful for. Whenever you bring up baby monitors, people immediately start lecturing you about radio bleed and cordless phones. And look, I get it. I'm a regular person. I understand how old tech works. But there is one specific detail about what happened in our rental that completely defies how radio waves actually behave in the physical world. This went down back in the winter of 2005. I was 9 years old at the time, living with my parents in a sprawling, drafty old rental house out in the suburbs of Grand Rapids, Michigan. My mom had just given birth to my little sister, which meant that the house was constantly echoing with the static hum of one of those old school safety first baby monitor things. It was the analog kind too. No video, no digital encryption, just a constant live audio feed broadcasting whatever was happening in the nursery straight to a plastic receiver boxer on the kitchen counter. Most nights, that little white box just put out a steady wall of white noise, occasionally picking up the sound of my sister shifting in her crib or the old radiator pipes clicking in the walls. One night, right around 10 o'clock, my dad and I were sitting at the kitchen table playing some cards. The house was completely quiet, when suddenly the monitor speaker stopped emitting its usual fuzz. The static cleared out perfectly, and this incredibly clear, close-range sound of a woman humming started coming through the speaker. It sounded like someone was leaning directly over the microphone, too. She was humming this low, rhythmic tune. Not a song that I'd ever heard before, just a heavy sort of melodic rise and fall. My dad figured the TV in the living room had been left on, so he walked out, checked it, and found the living room pitch black and the television completely off. When he came back into the kitchen, the humming was still coming through the speaker, perfectly steady. The layout of that house was long. The kitchen was at the very back, and my sister's nursery was all the way at the front of the house, down a 60-foot hallway. My dad, he picked up the receiver box, and my mum came out of her room, looking completely pale. They started walking down the long hallway together to check the crib, and I sort of trailed a few steps behind them. And here is the part that completely ruins the radio interference theory. As we physically walked closer to the nursery door, the audio coming out of the receiver box in my dad's hand began to lose volume. It didn't snap off or get garbled by static or anything. It faded out smoothly, exactly as if the person was backing away from the nursery monitor in direct response to our footsteps approaching the door. We also heard that voice coming from that room, very faintly. By the exact second that my dad turned the brass knob and pushed the nursery door open, the speaker in his hand went dead silent, reverting right back to the regular fuzzy white noise. My sister was completely fine, dead to the world in her little swaddle. The room, though, and I'll never forget this, was absolutely freezing. But other than that, everything was totally in its place. My dad tried to rationalize it, saying the monitor must have picked up a cross signal from a neighbor's house or a passing truck CB radio. But the exact same thing started happening 2 or even 3 times a week. It was always after 9 at night, the static would drop out, the clear, dry voice of a woman would start humming or softly singing nonsense syllables, and the absolute moment that anyone's foot crossed the threshold of that bedroom, the sound would dissolve into thin air. The breaking point for my mum, that happened on a Saturday afternoon in the spring. She was out on the side driveway washing her car, and she had left the nursery window open about 4 inches because it was getting warm out, and she swears on her life that while she was rinsing the hood of the car, she heard the exact same female voice humming, drifting directly out of the open second-story window. She dropped the hose, ran up the stairs, and burst into the nursery. The room, though, was empty. The baby was asleep, and the air was completely still. That was the day that my mum refused to use the monitor ever again. She unplugged both units, put them in a trash bag, and threw them into the garage. We lived in that house for another 8 months before our lease ran out, and while the house always felt incredibly heavy and cold, we never really heard the voice again without the monitor plugged in. I've looked into this a lot since I grew up too. Old analog monitors, they operate on the 49 megahertz frequency, which was notorious for picking up baby monitors from like 3 houses down at times, police scanners, or old cordless home phones, all of that. If we had just heard a voice, I would completely accept that we were just hearing a neighbor putting their own kid to sleep. I mean, that happens all the times with those old things. But a radio frequency from a neighbor's house doesn't have eyes. It doesn't monitor the hallway of a completely separate property, and perfectly fade its volume down to 0 the exact instant a specific bedroom door opens. They also don't really project sound from a bedroom where the outlet doesn't even exist. Whatever was triggering that microphone, it knew exactly when we were coming every time. This only happened about a month ago in Dublin, Ireland, 2024. I was walking around my area and decided to head into the forest since I hadn't been there in a while. I've had encounters with things in these woods before, but it's a pretty rare occurrence. Everything was going smoothly, found some new paths I hadn't seen before in fact, and barely any people around. Eventually I got to a point where there was a fork in the path. I took the right side and eventually learned that that way was blocked by thorns and nettles a bit down the path. As I stopped and went to turn around and go the other way, I noticed about 8 feet in front of me, where I intended to end up, a man standing there. He had completely normal skin and a healthy body, important for the next part, and he had a sort of short and stocky build. He was just staring at me, and I froze for a second, but then figured he probably got startled by me the same way that he startled me. So I kept going to turn around, but when I got about 2 steps down the left path, I stopped. He was still standing there, except something was seriously off. He was now slumped over in an inhuman position, like his spine had moved up and snapped. His skin was pale and covered in bruises, and he was still just standing there. At that, I quickly turned around and I got the heck out of there, not looking back. I only stopped when I found another person, and at that point, I slowed down to walk again. I'm usually not afraid of the things in those woods, but I definitely was not about to risk messing with, well, whatever that was. I can remember every single detail of this happening, even though I was only 7 years old. We'd moved to a new house that was a split plan, so my parents felt very far away, but I woke up in the night and couldn't go back to sleep, and started feeling scared for, well, no reason really. I got up out of bed and walked towards my sister's room. I heard some sort of soft noise from my bedroom and turned around to look. My parents had left the hall light on, and I could see my entire bed from the hallway. As I watched, the top sheet of the bed slowly started to slide upwards towards the pillow, almost as if someone was making the bed in sort of slow motion. Then suddenly the sheets jerked down to the bottom of the bed, and then up over the pillow again, and down and then up very quickly. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I was so scared that I couldn't move. I wanted to call out to my sister, but I couldn't get her name out. I can see the light turquoise sheets. I can picture the way my pillow was laying. I can feel the air on my arm standing up. Every detail. Ultimately, even though I couldn't yell her name, I eventually managed to push out some sort of gargling wail of terror, and and my sister, she came running out to the hallway. She told me that I'd probably imagined it. Older siblings, am I right? And to go back to bed. Instead, though, I crept into my parents' room and slept on the floor next to their bed. I also slept with my light on in my room for a long time after that. This happened in the late summer of 2014, but I remember it clearly, even 10 years later. In the fall of the previous year, I moved into an apartment with my boyfriend at the time. I was freshly 18 and he was 22. He was a socially inept groomer, but let's call him Mike. Mike was always emotionally distant and strange. We had many shared interests, but he refused to let me have friends, make new friends, or just go out and enjoy life in the city. I'd invite him to concerts for bands that he liked, and he'd decline. I'd offer to introduce him to my friends. He'd decline. I'd go out to a show with my friends or go hang out with my friends, and he'd send me a Word document, a deranged poetic slide describing every single fault of mine that he could discern. One time I smoked a little bit of pot and he compared me to Medea killing her children. When I say poetic, I mean poetic too. And when I say deranged, I mean deranged. Naturally, we broke up too. A friend of mine found him on a dating website and, well, that was that. My parents helped me lug his stuff into a truck and took him and all of his stuff to his parents' house. Done deal. I kept the apartment and I tried to settle back in. It was fine. I enjoyed my alone time and was free to have friends visit. Honestly, it seemed pretty ideal. Upon falling asleep on my second night alone, I was quickly woken up by a knock on my door though. I checked the time, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. And I mean, to heck with that, no thanks. So I tried to drift off again, but the knocking happened again. More rapidly, more aggressively. I kept ignoring it though. I didn't have that many friends, and the friends that I did have wouldn't be hanging on my door at 3 a.m. And eventually, that banging stopped. I enjoyed my next few days. I went out with friends, I had some drinks, came home alone, and I went to sleep. 4 a.m. again, and there's that banging. But this time, also some rattling. When I heard that, I realized that the guy was clearly trying to open the door. Luckily, this building was old and disgusting. Landlord paint jobs, roaches, and no AC, but what it did have was 2 deadbolts and a door chain, so I felt more curious than scared, I suppose. I took a look through the peephole and I saw a blonde man. He didn't look like a junkie or a weirdo, but I also didn't recognize him. And no, it wasn't Mike. He was dark-haired and would have written a poem before he tried to break down a door, but feeling young, stupid, and for whatever reason, safe enough to sleep, I just go back and I fall asleep. But this keeps happening. Every single night I go to sleep. Every single night he would knock. He bangs and slams at the door. He jiggles the doorknob left and right. He yanks at the doorknob. He flies into the door with the weight of his entire body, but he never talks. And for some reason, I never called the cops too. I think I was in my ACAB era, I don't know, but it went on for about a week, but I do call my friend Pete eventually. Pete and I hung out for the day. Maybe a bit of context here too is that Pete, he looked like the sniper in Saving Private Ryan. Skinny, bony, oddly serious. Pete couldn't hurt a fly, but he had a weird ghoulish face that made it seem as though he could. So we waited, and waited. We plotted and we constructed a plan. Speaking in whispers, we waited into the night. 12, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, then 3. And sure enough, there was knocking at the door. Go time. Out the peephole, we see the blonde man. What a surprise, right? He continues to knock, smash and bang on the door. With the chain lock on, we undid the 2 deadbolts. The knocking paused. We flick open the doorknob and, with a knife in each of our hands, scream at him. We stab stupid IKEA kitchen knives through the gap. We yell, "We're going to kill you, come back here and we're going to cut you," and we swish the blades around like pirates who are only allowed to carry butter knives. The blonde man, he sort of stumbles back and jogs down the hall. Pete and I laugh it off, and to my surprise, the blonde man never returned. All it took was matching his crazy, I suppose, but I will never know why he targeted me, or why he was so insistent in getting into my apartment of all places. Though I can guess, I suppose, and my guess is that he may have been stalking me for some time, and when he noticed that Mike was gone, maybe he saw that as his chance. Again, I guess I'll never really know, but when I think back on it, it was kind of a crazy time for me, and honestly, I'm glad it's over. When I was 7, my family, mum and 2 older brothers, 13 and 15, moved house. We moved to a street that was built on old tram tracks from around the 1900s. The line of terrace properties themselves were fairly new, but when we moved in, they were only around 15 years old max. All of the properties have a rear garden that was divided by a meter-tall wooden fence. Each garden has a shared rear wall that is 7 foot tall and made of concrete. This wall separates the properties from the grounds of the local park. So as a kid, I kept myself pretty much entertained all the time. The age gap between my brothers and I at that age was enough to be left out of most things, and my parents were recently divorced. So, I would make up games and act out imaginary scenes. It was not uncommon to find me playing off by myself in the back garden. We had pet rabbits that lived in a hutch that was up against the back wall mentioned earlier. Being the curious child that I was, I used to like to sort of stand on the hutch and look over the wall into the park and people watch. I remember it being a warm night, and the sun was setting a bit later in the day. I don't remember the time exactly, but with the way the daylight plays in my memory, it must have been around 7 p.m. I was out in the garden, people watching from my rabbit hutch vantage point, when I had the sudden urge to look over my right shoulder. With the way my house is laid out, the kitchen is at the rear of the house. If I were to enter the house, I'd open and walk through that kitchen. My neighbor's house, which would be on my right side as I looked back, is a bit different. Their sitting room is at the rear instead. So I look over my right shoulder and my neighbor's back door is open. There are no lights on, so it's dark in the sitting room and I can't really make anything out. But I know that they have a sofa facing out, and it would be where I was looking. That's when I see what look like 2 red dots, spaced apart, and not changing distance from one another, floating in the middle of this black room. I remember squinting, trying to figure out, what am I seeing? I kid you not as well. These 2 dots move in a smooth arc to the right and upwards, as if they were eyes on a face of someone standing up from the sofa. As they move, they seem to get a bit closer to the door, and I can make really nothing out except for, well, a dark silhouette. I freak out at that, and I run back inside, all the way to the front of the house where our sitting room is located, to tell my mum. She assures me that it's nothing, and so I head back outside. I climb back onto the rabbit hutch and immediately look behind me again. The figure with its red eyes is now standing in the doorway of their house, looking out into the garden. I nope once more back into the house, and this time, I do not go back outside. For years, I forgot about this experience, but I've always been afraid of the dark. I especially hate looking out of windows at night, particularly into the back garden. Something jogged my memory of it a few years ago, though, and every time I talk about it, honestly, it makes me sort of teary-eyed, because it was terrifying. I still remember every detail of that evening, and I wonder what it was that I saw. My neighbors still live there, and I'm too scared to ask them if they've experienced anything, or if they have an explanation for, well, whatever it was that I saw. At first, I was always too scared to tell anyone this story, and then when I did tell people, they always laughed at me. I really have no reason to make this up. I wasn't on drugs, and no, I'm not psychotic or anything. Back in the fall of 2017, I started my freshman year at Michigan State University. There's a trail behind some dorms, collectively called River Trail dorms because of their proximity to the Red Cedar River and the woods. The trail is colloquially called the Rape Trail because you enter it through a gap in a fence, and it can be known for some unsavory activity at night. I had never heard of an assumed happening there while I was there. Mainly it was just where kids went to smoke some weed and cigarettes, really. Well, I had become friends with a couple of boys, and one day after dark, they decided to go to the trail and smoke some weed, and I joined. I never smoked with them as I got obviously interrupted, but nevertheless, I sincerely do not believe that marijuana has anything to do with this story. Anyway, the boys were doing their thing when a figure walked into the open gap into the gate. We were at least 50 feet from this gap and the only people on the trail. It was probably close to 10 p.m. and besides the moon, the only lighting came big parking lot lights close to the gate opening. At first, the boys I was with said that the figure resembled a Korean international student that they knew. I had never met him, so I relaxed a little thinking everything was fine and this person was a friend. Well, they're calling out his name, but he never looks over at us, and he goes off the trail path into the sticks and leaves, but it doesn't make a sound. They're still calling for him, and I'm confused why he's acting so bizarre. I can sense the boys tensing up at this stage too. This is the only way that I can describe what happened next, but the boy morphed into a very tall, at least 7 feet, completely pitch black, featureless, clothless, not even human figure. It was human-shaped, I suppose, extremely skinny, but reflected no light and seemed almost two-dimensional. The figure looked at us dead on, though it was maybe 50 feet away. It moved toward us effortlessly in about 2 strides like it was floating. It came up to us almost head-on and still had no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just all black. Then, when it was so close that I could almost touch it, it morphed into the international student, back down to a probably 5'6" human male. The boys were extremely apprehensive and feigned normalcy, but were probably just playing it cool. I asked him questions and he lit a cigarette, but I can't recall him speaking or answering anything, just sitting there, smoking. We eventually excused ourselves and pretty much ran back to our dorm. I was not the first person to speak. It was my friend who asked, "Did we just see Slender Man?" I said yes, and let's not talk about it anymore. The other kid was speechless and said nothing, and really, we never spoke about it ever again. Eventually, we all drifted apart within the semester, and I haven't spoken with them since 2018. I truly thought that this was the end, that I was going to die that night. To this day, I have never been more terrified too. It was to the point that I almost don't fear humans at all, and the only thing that makes me scared is paranormal stuff now. I don't go into the woods very much anymore too, only ever in broad daylight, and even then not so much. I have a deep respect for nature, and I know that the woods are just not my territory, especially at night. I still have no idea what you would categorize this as. I mean, I've called it a skinwalker, but I'm really not sure that that's accurate at all. Obviously, Slender Man isn't real, but minus the suit, it was kind of dead on, to be honest. I don't know. If people could provide more information, then I would like to learn more, and I can't be the only one who has ever seen something like this. The location opened in 1878 and was originally known as the Eastern Michigan Asylum for the Insane. In 1911, it became known as the Pontiac State Hospital, then was renamed again in 1973 as the Clinton Valley Center. It ultimately closed in 1997, with all but one of the structures being torn down in 2000. When it first opened its doors, the Eastern Michigan Asylum for the Insane treated 222 patients, alleviating overcrowding from the psychiatric hospital in Kalamazoo. It grew over the years, having many additions and extra buildings constructed on the grounds. It reached its peak of operations in the 1950s as the Pontiac State Hospital, with approximately 3,100 patients residing within. By the 1970s, that number had declined to roughly 800. When it closed as the Clinton Valley Center in 1997, there were only 200 patients left, even less than when it had opened as a much smaller location over a century ago. The last remaining structure was seemingly a children's unit, given the presence of a playground outside and classrooms, a gymnasium, and a pool inside. Other than the individual cell-like rooms, it seemed to be structured much like a school, too. Most of my experiences on the grounds happened in this building between the years of 2007 and 2017. I believe it was sometime between 2017 and 2020 that it was torn down, but this is the last piece of info that I can't seem to find anything on to confirm. As a side note, a memorial for patients who died and were never claimed by family members stands at the Oak Hill Cemetery just down the road in downtown Pontiac. The names listed on the memorial have death dates ranging from 1880 to 1962. Some places on the list are left blank, seeming to suggest that some sort of names and the exact dates of their deaths have been forgotten and/or lost to time. Now, the first time that I went to Clinton Valley Center, or rather the last building still standing, it was as a let's go do some urbex stuff situation, fueled by teenage stupidity. Our collective knowledge about urban exploration was minimal at best. However, old asylums surrounded by neighborhoods, strip malls, and open fields seemed the safer option compared to abandoned buildings downtown that are known to have drug addicts and gang members passing through. We didn't take the paranormal into account at all. Our first couple of visits, there wasn't much that happened really, other than a few feelings of being watched, I suppose. But on the third or fourth visit, some of us, myself included, began to catch glimpses of movement at the edges of our vision. There was never any color to them, just sort of flickers of shadowy figures peeking around corners or darting across doorways. We saw these shadows in a lot of places, but mainly in the corridors, the areas that would have had the most traffic day to day. The administrative offices also had quite a bit of shadow activity too. Sometime after the first shadow sightings, some of us also began to hear whispers. It was never anything clear enough to pick any words out of, but still, it had the distinctive sound of human speech. By the pitch, it also sounded like children, I would guess. I seemed to be the one affected most by this, as I could hear multiple whispers coming from the administrative offices the first time that we went into that wing anyway. That's actually the reason that I never went in there too. Hearing those whispers, it filled me with a sense of dread so visceral that I just couldn't bring myself to go anywhere near that part of the building, even though others in our group went in with nothing to report back about. There was another time, though, that we found the entrance to the boiler room open. It was a large room with the door opening to a landing that then had a walkway of metal grating wrapping around the middle of the room, which was occupied by a giant mass of pipes and machinery. There were stairs going up from the landing to an upper walkway, as well as a door to the roof, while another set of stairs to the right of the landing that went down to the floor of the boiler room. A smaller room off to the side on this basement level opened out into a concrete-walled pit outside the building, with a metal grate hatch over the top of it. My guess is to get machine parts in and out without disturbing the patients. That small room also had access to a long, dark maintenance tunnel that ran under at least one of the corridors. It was small, the bottom of it being about 3 feet above the basement floor, forcing one to either crouch or crawl if they were to go in. Our phone lights, and even a stronger flashlight, the one time that we brought one, couldn't reach the end of that tunnel though. It was like the darkness sort of had substance to it. Staring into it too long gave some of us the urge to crawl in as well, which was weird. We avoided the basement level after that visit. A couple of weeks after our short delve into the basement though, I was on a walk through the fields near the building, which led me to feeling compelled to enter it by myself. I had packed a small lunch with me and sat down in the central courtyard to have a bit of a picnic. Yes, I know that entering an abandoned place alone was really a bad idea, and that even if there wasn't a known paranormal aspect to the location. But again, I felt compelled to do so, and previous visits to the location had probably led me to believe that I knew the safe zones within the building. Well, while I was eating my lunch, I suddenly heard voices, more like adults and much louder than the childlike whispers I had heard before in the corridor that I was facing. I still couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like they were directly in front of me, having a regular conversation as they walked down the hallway. The windows, they were busted out, so really I should have had a clear view of whoever it was as they walked by. I even heard glass from the broken windows crunching on the floor at one point, but I never saw a single person there. After that, though, I left quickly and quietly. Following my experiences with the disembodied voices and footsteps, my friends decided that we should go and check things out again. At first, the place was as silent as the first few times that we'd visited. As we passed by the boiler room, somebody mentioned that we'd never actually been up to the roof. Figuring that since we were already next to the stairs, we entered the boiler room and we headed up, finding the roof access door to be unlocked. The section of roof this led to was only for the area above the boiler room, so we couldn't walk very far. However, one of the walls of the boiler room formed part of the enclosure of a second courtyard, one that we'd never seen before. One of the other walls was also windowless like that of the boiler room, but the 2 remaining walls with windows belonged to sections that we had never been to. From up on the roof, we could see that the wall opposite the boiler room was part of a hallway. From previous visits to the area where the doors to that hallway were, we knew that it was inaccessible, the doors to it being locked. However, the last wall was lined with windows into some of the patient rooms. Most of them were boarded up, but a couple near the unexplored hallway were unblocked. With nothing else going on, we decided to enter that section of the building. From previous visits, we knew that area was very dark. It seemed the only light entering it was through the windows of those 2 rooms and through the entrance to the ward itself. And yes, ward, because unlike the rest of the building, where patient rooms lined the corridors, this area seemed to be more like an actual hospital area. There was a sitting area where we entered, with a nurse's station in the middle. There was a hallway lined with doors to the patient rooms going back from either side of the nurse's station. Another hallway ran between the 2 at the far end of the ward. Between these hallways and the nurse's station was what looked to be a supply room, I would guess. In any case, we entered the ward and walked through the sitting area and down the hallway that ran alongside the courtyard. Next to the 2 rooms with missing windows, we found an unlocked set of doors that led into the hallway that had been blocked at the other end. We entered into the room nearest those doors, and some of the guys began talking about hopping out the window and into the courtyard, as there didn't seem to be any actual doors leading out to it. There was also an argument about the windows being just high enough that whoever went out there might not be able to climb back in. As this conversation was happening, me and one of my friends were standing near the door when we heard the distinct sound of crunching footsteps over the glass littering the sitting area. We quickly hushed the other guys and slowly closed the door, having enough presence of mind to make it look like the wind had caught it in case somebody else really was in the building with us. We all heard the footsteps continuing to walk across the sitting area and down the hallway, following our exact path before turning into the room next to us, and then closing the door. We heard more footsteps from inside the room, and then complete silence. We kept completely quiet for like several minutes, during which we heard no other sounds. Eventually, one of the guys who had been talking about hopping out the window and into the courtyard volunteered to sit on the windowsill and lean out to try and peek into that room. With a couple of others holding his arm to anchor him, he looked into the neighboring room and saw, well, nothing. There was no one there. Even though we all heard the footsteps, there was only an empty room behind that closed door. Figuring that was enough strangeness for one day, we unanimously decided to leave at this point. We first carefully peeked into the hallway to make sure that we hadn't misheard the footsteps in the room next to us, to be certain that no one was lurking in the darkness of the ward, and with the coast seemingly clear, we began to head toward the exit as quietly as we could. Those of us bringing up the rear turned to look back as we entered the sitting area, and that was when the door to the other room suddenly flew open and slammed against the wall. The rest of the group also turned back at this point, and then that was when we heard footsteps running toward us. Before we knew it, we were outside the ward standing near the missing door that led to the parking lot. Those of us near the back had stopped because we noticed the footsteps had ground to a halt just at the entrance of the ward. There was plenty of light there, but still, no one to be seen. Whatever it was, we speculated, seemed to be bound to that ward. As our group left, we swore to never go to that part of the building again, and a light-hearted comment was made about how we seemed to be labeling more and more of the place off-limits because of all the paranormal happenings. It was our next visit, though, that would be the last time that any of us would ever set foot in that place again. It was at least a couple of months before anyone talked about the building again after this experience, much less going back. When we finally did go back, no one really felt up to exploring the place anymore. I mean, after all, we had pretty much been everywhere by that point. We'd seen the classrooms, the gymnasium, the pool and its attached shower rooms, the restrooms, the kitchen, the administrative offices. We'd been to the patient rooms and the hospital-like ward. We went to those courtyards, the boiler room, the rooftop in the basement. Really, the only place that we hadn't explored was the tunnel or tunnels under the building. But we'd rejected that idea along with ever going into the basement ever again. The ramp-up in activity with each of our visits also played a part in this, even if most of us wouldn't admit it. In the end, the only reason that we decided to go back into the building was to prank another group of friends. The plan was that we'd enter through the missing door, the same one next to the dark ward that we'd been chased out of the previous time, and turn right into one of the normal hallways lined in the patient rooms. The room right next to that door had its window busted out, but the bushes out front were so overgrown that we could easily hide in the room and see what was happening out in the parking lot. We'd text the other group to meet us inside the building, then jump out of the room to scare them. You know, just stupid teenage shenanigans. Well, the door to the room, very metal and very heavy by the way, naturally swung into an open position, so me and a couple of the other guys took turns leaning against it to keep it shut. The three of us all went still at the same moment, then gave each other the looks that simultaneously asked, "Did you hear that too?" and confirmed, that they did hear it. We heard two voices, a little boy and a little girl, whispering and giggling to each other out in the hallway, right on the other side of the door. As we were about to tell the others, the other group showed up though, and called out to us, saying that they had seen one of us in the window, and they weren't going to fall for any of the scare pranks that we had planned. With the cat out of the bag now, a couple of the guys decided to just jump out of the window and move out between the wall and the bushes. Another guy stepped past me and reached out for the doorknob. As soon as his hand touched it, every hair on my body stood on end though, and I instinctively shoved him out of the way. The door flew open and slammed against the wall, almost hitting one of the other guys. The next thing that I knew, the tips of my toes were barely touching the ground as I was flung backward 5 feet and pinned to a wall, my airway completely blocked off. In the chaos that followed, half of the guys clambered over one another as they leapt out of the window and into the bushes, while the other half bolted out the door around the corner and out of the door into the parking lot. Only the other two who had heard the voices with me stayed, rushing to grab my arms and pull me from the wall. They had to drag me outside, and it was only once that I was over the threshold that I could breathe again. They said that when I got flung back, I had turned deathly pale, and my color only started to come back once I was outside and able to breathe again. We beat a hasty retreat after that, or as hasty as possible with me needing help walking across the parking lot. It was only after we had left the grounds that I fully regained my color, strength, and ability to breathe again. However, as we began walking back to the nearest of the friends' group's houses, I had periodic episodes where I'd turn pale again and begin dry heaving too. Nothing ever came out, but my shadow told a different story. You see, a barely visible shadow, like the way a brighter light can cast the shadow of a flame, came out of my shadow's mouth and pulled on the ground. I don't know what that was, ectoplasm, but it was only visible from my shadow, never my physical body, which was absolutely bizarre. And as you can imagine, after that, we never went back to the building. Although, we did return to the grounds a few more times over the following years, mostly as a shortcut to the fields and small patches of woods beyond. Now, perhaps not too surprisingly, the fields and the woods near the children's building were also once part of the grounds of the original asylum. That would probably explain the strange occurrences that happened in those areas too, although nothing quite like what happened in the building. There was a large section of fields that was relatively flat. From a map I've seen of the original asylum's buildings, that flat section was where the back half of the main complex had stood. The grass there was left to grow wild, often flattening naturally from wind and the changing seasons. There were also a few small clusters of trees that had sprouted up too. On a few occasions, me and some of my friends would see a dark figure in the distance, either sort of crouch down in a tall clump of grass or step behind a group of trees. We'd never see them come out of hiding, and it was only after we'd passed by and noticed that no one was there that we recognized the figures as shadow people. In one of the wooded areas, there were some concrete structures too, seemingly the foundations of a few small buildings, at what was once the edge of the grounds, I think. There were no traces of any of the walls, but we always guessed that there were maybe housing and or storage areas for the groundskeepers. This would also possibly fit with the flat-topped ridge that cut through the woods, with a fairly flat path curving across the fields to where the asylum once stood. The ridge, it had some old train tracks half buried on top of it, but the rest of the tracks leading to the asylum had either been removed or fully swallowed by the ground at this stage. With a train yard just on the other side of the creek from that ridge, it seems like it may have been used to transport things like coal and supplies to the asylum. Anyway, the area the concrete structures were in was heavily overgrown. Trees and branches had fallen over the years and undergrowth had sprouted up all around, sometimes even within the foundations, if the concrete had cracked enough for a seed to take root. There was also always a sense that we shouldn't stand on those foundations. The one time a small group of us did, the woods suddenly got very quiet, eerily so, and it felt like we were standing in a small room crammed full of people. We quickly got off the concrete, but the woods stayed silent until we left that day, and it felt like we were being watched the whole time too. Now, although this was in Pontiac, technically part of the greater Detroit metropolitan area, it was also a stone's throw from Waterford and other towns that quickly transitioned from urban streets to suburban neighborhoods to rural farms, forests, and fields. So, there was plenty of wildlife in the area, including deer. However, no larger predators, at least not around the asylum, not even stray or feral dogs. Animal control was pretty good about that here. With that being said, it was very odd to be walking through waist-high grass and suddenly find ourselves in a flattened circle with no other trails leading in or out. It was even stranger to find the front half of a completely clean deer skeleton in the middle of the circle. It was just an antlered skull, 2 legs ending in the hooves, and a rib cage. The rest of it was nowhere to be seen, even when we looked around the area. Maybe there's a rational explanation for it, I get that. I mean, other than the way that we found the bones being odd, there was nothing supernatural that occurred while we were there or anything. However, given that it was on the former grounds of the asylum and seemingly had no reason for being there, I figured that I should include this. Well, following the demolition of most of the asylum structures in the year 2000, a neighborhood was constructed where the front half of the asylum's buildings had been. Considering my personal experiences in the children's building and the former grounds, it really makes me wonder if any of the homes experienced anything supernatural. A group of local government officers stands in front of the neighborhood on what was once the asylum's front lawn. The MDOT Oakland Transportation Service Center was built on a back road behind where the children's units had been. Between the time that I had moved away from the area, around the beginning of 2017, and the pandemic around the end of 2019, the children's unit was also finally torn down. It was now a flat field, much like where the back half of the asylum's main cluster of buildings had stood. In more recent years, that larger area of fields has seen the construction of 2 new locations. One, fairly close to where the children's unit once stood, is Haven, a shelter for mothers and their children. Given that there's a playground outside and children living there, I can't help but feel it's a little too similar and too close to where the other buildings used to be. The other new location is a FedEx freight center. It primarily occupies an area that used to be just a field on the grounds surrounding the asylum, an area where my friends and I never really experienced anything paranormal. The last remaining section of fields and woods, the area where the concrete structures sit next to the ridge with the train tracks, and where we found the skeleton of a half deer in the tall grass, has remained mostly unaltered. There are now clearly defined dirt tracks weaving around the field, seeming to suggest that it's become the preferred riding spot for 4-wheelers and dirt bikes. I will never forget my experiences from this location. It's something that has stuck with all of us, in fact. And, like I said, I do wonder if any of these people that are living here have experienced anything like what we did. So when I was a kid, I used to be terribly afraid of the dark. I would have to sleep with the closet light on and the bedroom door open to the living room where my mum would be watching TV late into the night. My bed, it was situated in the room where my head was to the wall in the back corner of the room, looking directly out of the door and into the living room. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night. The closet light was still on and the living room light was off because my mum had gone to bed. Everything was dead silent, and I looked out the door to the living room where I saw a silhouette just beyond the reach of the closet light. It was human-shaped, looked male, was tall, I would say about 6.5 feet or so, and wearing a bowler-type hat. For what felt like hours, I just sat there staring at it, and it never moved. I eventually meekly called out to it, asking who was there, but got no reply. Looking back, if it had been an intruder, that would have been a bad idea, but after this, I reached over to my bookcase and grabbed a light, keeping my eyes on the shape the entire time. I flicked on the flashlight, and there was nothing there, just the living room. After a bit of time, I got up and walked into the living room and began searching the house. Again, if it were an intruder, I would have been in a lot of trouble, but my search, it came up empty. The basement door was still latched shut, and the attic door is behind that as well, so nobody was down there. The bathroom, the living room, the kitchen, parents' room, cat's room, both hallway closets, brother's room, and no tall man with a hat. At this point, I was convinced that I had just been seeing things, and I went back into the living room where I looked in the direction of where I would have been looking to see the shape, but there was nothing that could have made that shape, just the coffee table and an armchair in that strip of sight. I went back to bed eventually, and when I laid down and shut off the flashlight, I looked out and didn't see the shape this time. And I have had a thing about being uncomfortable with open doors ever since then. This, though, is not where it ended. I had never told anyone about this encounter for years afterward. However, one day my mum and I were talking in the car, and she mentioned that like a year or two after I had seen this shape, my brother had been really sick with a high fever, and she had been taking care of him when I asked her who the guy in the hallway with the hat was. But when she looked, she didn't see anything. This immediately raised some alarm bells because, like I said, I didn't tell anyone about seeing it. Also, ever since I saw this man's shape just outside of my doorway, when I go through the living room, I get this deep, unshakable feeling that I'm being watched. And the longer that I stay in there, the closer it gets. The feeling immediately goes away when I get far enough down the hallway or into my bedroom, and it only ever happens really late at night, at around 2 to 5 in the morning. Now, there is one last thing that happened in relation to this, besides still getting the feeling of being watched every night, that I had to go to the kitchen or the bathroom. I started a job, and I was at work when a clearly disturbed man came into the store. He seemed to be in deep conversation with someone who wasn't there, referring to the person who wasn't there as Alex during the one-sided conversation. As he was passing by me, he stopped though, and looked behind me and up and said to me, "Who's your friend? I love his hat," before he just continued walking, and that absolutely chilled me to the bone. I do sometimes get this feeling just out and about that I'm being watched for a few seconds and get really creeped out, so it makes me wonder if this shape follows me outside the house sometimes. It would be easy to just dismiss what he said since he clearly wasn't all there, but it was really specific how he mentioned the hat and looked up as if he were looking at someone taller than me. My pops needed a partner to go on a bow hunt with since his hunting buddy got a tag somewhere else. He's been hunting for the better part of like 40 years now, so I couldn't let him go alone, and so we packed up to hunt in the Toyabe National Forest near Kingston in the Arcdome Wilderness area. This particular spot that we decided to scout was located north of Kingston called Weeks Canyon. It's mostly rugged, high Sierra desert, but this spot has a creek running from way up high, and we figured if the deer would come to drink, then that would be a good place to go naturally. So we set up camp at the entrance to the canyon, and there's bugs, birds, bees, all sorts of wildlife just bustling around. Lots of dense green bush all over, and some big junipers sprouted all over too. We came up and head up the canyon to see if we can find any sign. About 1.5 miles in, though, my pop stops and is dead silent. He whispers to me, "Do you hear anything?" I pause, holding my breath, and listen, but nothing. So I tell him that. "Nah, Dad, I got nothing." He responds and says, "Exactly. There's no birds, no squirrels, no chipmunks. Son, there's not even insects here." Then it hits me. The place is living, but like dead. The wild berries that the plants grow were fully ripened, most so ripe that they fell off and rotted. The trails were untouched, no tracks of any kind, only our boot prints leading to that point. We figured it's just an anomaly or pressure from other hunters, but we pressed on for about maybe another half a mile, turned around and saw nothing at all. That afternoon at camp, we were finishing up dinner, and then over 100 birds just flew in from the valley below and landed in the bush near our camp. No one had gone into the canyon, so that was pretty odd behavior for them. After discussing this and some general uneasiness, we eventually went to bed. I was plagued by the oddest dreams that night too. None that I can recollect, but I awoke at 4ish as we were headed out to do some morning scouting. My dad steps out to pee. Then when he came back, I did the same. And I cannot explain to you the feeling that I had, but I'm going to try. There were eyes on me, and they were not small. I could feel them all over, but only from one source. I was whipping my head back and forth, and my mind was in such a fight or flight mode that I forgot that I was even using the bathroom. I hastily went back into the tent, sat down without saying a word, and my dad said, "You feel it too, huh?" I told him, "Yeah, something's out there, man." And my dad interrupted saying, "It's not normal like this." And to hear that come out of my dad's mouth really got under my skin. All these years hunting and mining in remote places, and he's never been spooked like this. We stayed in the tent until some more natural light came out of the sky. We hopped in the car and we scouted elsewhere that morning. I keep racking my brain about it though, and I was thinking, maybe it's just a mountain lion, but I've been in some bad situations before. I used to work in a prison and did a tour overseas even. I've even had the feeling of being stalked, but this one shot straight into my soul. I just cannot shake the unnatural of it all. Water, but no wildlife. Birds leaving the water source to reside in a desert flat. And mostly, the feeling of whatever that thing was that came to observe us. Maybe I'm just hyping it up because I'm mostly a city boy, but again, the way my pops reacted, I don't know. He's been out in these sorts of places millions of times, and to see him like that, it says to me that I wasn't imagining it. So I've just gotten home from my night shift and have just had the craziest night of my life. I work in an aircraft hangar that was built in the late 40s at a well-known airport in the UK. It is well known by many people around the airport that lots of strange things have happened in this hangar, including people running out of the hangar in the early hours of the morning and refusing to work a night shift there ever again. Well, I had an experience myself a year ago whilst it was undergoing refurbishment. I was the only person in the hangar, and whilst getting some things ready for an aircraft, I heard 3 knocks on a door that connected to a fire escape from the room that I was in. For some reason, I assumed that someone was playing a prank, and I knocked back on the door. A minute later, I heard it again, and instantly shivers ran down my spine. I ran out of the room, looked in the fire escape, and nobody was there. I sprinted out of the hangar as fast as I could, and I didn't go back that day. Multiple other people who worked in there have had experiences like seeing black figures and hearing noises. Now, I only found this out a couple of days ago, but Sadly, somebody took their life in the hangar. He went to the top floor of the rooms at the back of the hangar and hung himself from the ceiling rafters, unfortunately. On the last set of shifts, I was on holiday, but my colleagues went exploring around the hangar with a couple of guys from another company that works here, and they found a chair, a noose, and a large cross on the top floor of the rooms that look over the hangar. The top floor just has a railing looking over the building, all abandoned rooms that nobody goes in, but there was also writing on the metal rafters that said the name of the person who passed away and the date that he died too. Everyone was stunned and blaming each other, saying that they must have put it up there and it was a horrible, sick prank. That was when they heard a massive bang and they all ran out. As tonight was my first night back on shift, the first thing that we did was to go back up to the room because I didn't believe what they were saying and everyone had gone. The chair, the rope, and the cross were nowhere, along with the writing on the metal roofing, but there was something absolutely unbelievable. A handprint in red, almost paint-like, and the letters saying leave. This definitely wasn't here before, and honestly, I still don't believe this because, it's just so ridiculous. It's like a cringe horror movie, right? We heard an almost grunt or angry-sounding noise though, and we left very quickly after that. Later on that night, we got together with the guys from the other company, and were explaining that it had all gone and that the handprint had appeared. They didn't believe us, so we took them up there to show them. I cannot even believe what I saw with my own eyes though, but when we got up there, the door to the room, only one way in, no other entrance, had been barricaded with a piece of metal shelving from the abandoned floor below. Once we got in, the chair, the noose, the cross were all back in that room, now pointed at the doorway. We were all there in disbelief when we heard another bang, and that was when we ran as fast as we could out of there. We then went to the floor below, also abandoned but completely closed with no light. I said about 10 times I really don't think that we should be going and doing this, and that I had a bad feeling when we literally saw an object appear mid-air and crash onto the 30-plus pieces of metal shelving that had been used to block the door upstairs. We all ran out and I tripped on a piece of metal that was left on the floor, nearly breaking my leg. It was all so unbelievable and worrying that, honestly, I sort of hope that someone is playing a dark joke on us. But because of the many people that I've heard horrible stories about this hangar from, I'm really starting to believe that this stuff is real. I enjoy my job, and I certainly don't want to disrespect any spirits who may be there, but I just want to be left alone. So, does anyone have any tips for making sure that it doesn't affect me anymore, and how to deal with things if they happen again? Obviously, they don't want us going to the upper floors, but the experience that I had before was on the ground floor. If I could get some feedback for this, that would be great, as the whole situation has completely blown my mind. My daughter, who is 3, is finally talking to where we can understand most of what she says. We recently bought a house and finished moving in. It's a nice, quiet neighborhood, outside of our next door Karen, but that's another story. My sister and my wife said that they heard my daughter talking with someone in her room the other day, though. They heard someone responding to her as well, which was very weird. Upon investigating, there was nobody there, though. I told them that they must have been hearing things and she was just playing and practicing her speech or something. 2 days later, though, I had my first ever case of sleep paralysis. It was about 3 in the morning and I was drifting off to sleep. Shortly before or shortly after I fell asleep, I'm not quite sure, I locked up and felt like I was being laid on. I heard creepy exhaling in my left ear that was really quiet at first and got really loud. I broke myself out of it by screaming babe, but I guess I didn't scream because my wife was still asleep. I've never had that happen even in houses that were confirmed to be haunted, so this was very strange. Anyway, the following morning I walked to my daughter's room because I'm sure it was the same time that she'd been talking to, because the presence was definitely an angry female. I started speaking so as to address the thing. I said that this was my house now and that they aren't welcome here. I said that I will not be held down in my own bed and it will not terrify my daughter or talk to her at all ever again. I said that I'm giving it the option to leave on its own or I would be calling a priest. This was mainly to give respect to it since I believed it was human at one point, and I wanted to give it that human option. After I finished speaking, the air felt lighter and nothing happened for a very good while. Fast forward 5 months later though to tonight, my daughter has been inconsolably crying in her own room, the new room, but we moved her across the house. I'd been checking on her every hour, making sure that she had everything that she needed, and nothing was working. My wife came into the room and started talking to her, and she uttered out that she was scared. When we asked what of, she pointed to the upper corner of her room above her bed and said, "She's so up there." We said, "Who is she?" without an answer. I told her to come to me, face the corner she was pointing at, and tell it to go away. She happily did and turned back to me. I was chatting with my wife about it, and she turned around and said, "Where did she go?" So I repeated the question that she asked me, and she looked around and said, "She's right there," pointing on the ceiling, in between the two corners now directly above her bed. I spoke to what I believe now is someone who might be attached to the house, saying, "I thought we fixed this issue, but I guess I'm going to have to call the priest since you don't want to leave." I told my daughter that if she sees her again, to say go away. We left her bedroom light on and gave her some milk, and that seems to have done the trick to get her to sleep. Now, the reason why I'm here is because I'm wondering if anyone has any advice on what this could be. How would I go about explaining this to a priest, and does this even require a priest? I have so many unanswered questions, but something is scaring my daughter and I need it to stop. Over a year ago, I was forced to move out of my apartment due to a serious mold problem that was making people sick, and the management refused to remediate it to the extent that we needed them to, and they did as little as legally possible, basically. But because of all of my things that were there essentially were caked in toxic mold spores, it was a huge effort to thoroughly clean what could be cleaned and bring the rest to the dump. We didn't thrift them because, well, the contamination was either too difficult or just not possible to clean certain items, like couches and mattresses and things like that. But anyway, my sister-in-law was helping me sort through everything that I owned to determine what was worth keeping and cleaning. I lost most of my belongings at this stage, but while we worked, she kept saying that she felt uncomfortable in certain rooms and couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't think too much of it. We were alone at night, and I suggested that we move out to the brightly lit porch instead. Every now and then she would turn back inside to grab a box or a tool or whatever, and then she said that she saw some shadow figures. She said that she didn't say anything earlier because it might have been her imagination, but now apparently she was sure. Well, we had done a lot of work, so we decided to just wrap things up and leave in the end. Now, on the way back to the car, she glanced back at the unit and she froze. She then says, "Look in the windows. You don't see that?" I didn't see anything out of the ordinary at first. She then held firmly onto my arm while trembling slightly and said, "How do you not see that? It's right there." She was apparently seeing a shadow figure, clear as day, looking right at us. Now, I may not have seen anything or felt anything, but just the fact that she was just standing behind me, gripping my arm harder and harder, and now had tears in her eyes. This woman is no actor. She was genuinely terrified. So now I was a little bit spooked myself. We got into the car and we left, and she said that the thing followed us with its face. I don't think that she could see discernible eyes though, as when we drove past it. We said some prayers to St. Michael and others, and really, that was about it. Now, could it have just been the mold problem? Maybe, but as far as I know, the mold in there, it really shouldn't have caused anything like that. Could she have just been seeing things? Possibly, but why the reaction like that? To this day, I'm really not sure what happened, but all I know is that it was a bit of a scary experience, and to be honest, I was glad that I was leaving. So I'm a man living alone in an apartment, for reference. I was walking into my building this evening, and a lady that I've never talked to before, and rarely even seen, said hello. I'm personable and polite, so I said hello back and went to walk into the building. Then she asked how I was and how the weekend was going. I assumed it was just some friendly small talk, so I obliged, and then immediately she asked where I worked and how long I've lived in the building for, which threw me a little bit but seemed innocent enough. Then, about as soon as I finished answering, she said, "No one has ever helped me or offered me help my whole life, and I'm just trying to better myself, but nobody will help. People don't ask me to go out and do any fun things, and I like to do fun things." So I just kind of stammered something about how that's rough or whatever. Again, immediately once I stopped talking, she started up the same thread, a bit frustrated and exasperated. "I don't have any friends. No one offers help. I'm just a nice person." I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically it. This whole time she's like barely blinking though, won't break eye contact, and is kind of cornering me as well. My hair on the back of my neck is up and my skin is crawling, and my super came out and said that she needed me for something and got me inside. She then told me that I really shouldn't be talking to her. I said that I thought maybe she was just lonely and socially inept, but she said to avoid her. Women like this seem to have a good instinct about dangerous or unhinged people, so I plan on following her advice, but as someone with friends on the spectrum and having worked with the mentally disabled in my life, I at first thought that maybe it was just that. Now, it's been a few hours and honestly, I still cannot shake this uneasy feeling. I thought that I would ask anybody here if they knew what this might be, or maybe if this is ringing any bells or setting alarms off for anyone, because I don't want to treat someone who is just eccentric as a pariah, undeservedly too. But honestly though, I would be lying if I didn't say that my gut is screaming for me to be careful. I was traveling with some friends on some 4x4 trails in southern Idaho. We were camping out one night, singing music around a campfire for quite a while, and my friends decided to go to bed eventually. My ex and I stayed up a little bit longer, hanging out around the fire and just enjoying the atmosphere. Then suddenly, everything just got dead silent, like the world got put on mute. I'm no stranger to this phenomenon. It generally happens when there's a predator nearby, and being in bear country, I had my bear spray on me, so I wasn't too worried. My ex and I continued to enjoy the fire though until we heard someone way off in the distance say, "honey," 3 times. You could tell it was far away, but it also had the sound of a whisper rather than a yell, an almost questioning tone, like it was a woman calling out for her husband. My friend peeked out of his rooftop tent and asked if we were the ones calling out, but we weren't. The weirdest thing though is that it just didn't sound right. More so something that sounds like a woman calling out honey, but not actually a human woman. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but the more rational side of us decided that it may have been a hiker or something. The moon was full, so the idea of a couple hiking at night especially since we weren't too far from the nearest town. Wasn't too unlikely, I guess. My friend and his girlfriend, they decided to rejoin us for a little bit, and they also commented on the lack of wildlife sounds. We sat for a few more minutes before, again, hearing that honey sound. My friend agreed that it didn't sound right at all. He called out hello just in case there was some poor lost woman somewhere, but nothing responded. A few minutes later, we heard the same call, but from the complete opposite direction. With how far it sounded, there is just no way some lost hiker could have circled all the way around our camp that quickly. We lit up our floodlights, and we quickly booked it out of the area, and ended up cutting our overland trip very short. I still have no idea who or what made those noises, and it really still creeps me the heck out. Honestly, too, I'm really not sure if I'll be traveling to southern Idaho ever again. Now, I know that this sounds fantastical and wild, and honestly, I couldn't disagree. This is in fairly remote backcountry, West Virginia, which is known for being old and haunted. It was experienced entirely by the two of us, but the worst parts by all four. This led to all four of us at some point battling personal issues in our lives that I believe stemmed directly from this encounter. The following is, at least to my memory and what I've been able to corroborate with the other people that were there, 100% accurate and true. So when I was 17, 2004, we had a bad experience camping near haunted train tunnels and sites of sudden tragic death. The history of the immediate 1 square mile area is that mother and son drowning in the creek nearby, drug dealers killed in state police shootout at a nearby hunting cabin, and many years before, cheap laborers had been killed building this double set of train tunnels. They were actually buried in a long-forgotten little graveyard nearby the tunnels that has since been found and restored. We decided to go camping before graduation as a friend group of 4, just to do something one last time before we all went our separate ways in life. This is a private property on the backside of a big hill around which the creek flows in a huge several-mile-long bend. A camp set up and fire going. Shortly after nightfall, my cousin and I sat back on the creek bed, maybe 20 yards away from the camp spotlight, a fish in the water. We then began to hear a sort of, rhythmic sloshing sound. A slosh of what sounded like somebody wading through the water, maybe halfway up to their shin deep. So we shined the light around upstream, and we then spotted symmetrically and rhythmically consistent disturbances made by what looked and sounded like invisible feet or legs sloshing toward us. When we would turn our spotlights off, it would start again. It would then stop when illuminated, and whatever it was definitely reacting to us. And this was the first ice bucket stomach clench moment we knew that this was not fish and could not rationalize what was actually happening. This scared us pretty badly, but we decided best to be kept to ourselves and join the others gathered at the fire suddenly. As we made our way back, we heard the sloshing make its way to where we were on the bank and the noise stopped. Given the speed that we witnessed it moving and how far it was from us when we were watching it, it must have sped up to make it to the bank that we were on in the amount of time that it took us to get to the camp. Others at the camp heard it as well and figured that we'd either gotten in or somehow riled up some fish, but we just played it off in the end. And as crazy as it sounds, it sounded and looked like an invisible person wading towards us through the water. After the noise ended at the creek bank, we then all saw the tall grass disturbed as something that we couldn't see ran around the foliage perimeter of our circularly cleared campsite. Now, this could have been an animal, I admit, but whatever it was fast. We then began to hear what sounded like a man talking to us, as in speaking into the ear of each person, the left ear, if that matters. At first, it sounded like garble, really, but after maybe 15 to 20 seconds, we could make out the words saying we shouldn't be there and we needed to leave, before finally addressing us directly and saying slightly more forcefully, "You need to leave." Obviously, as you can imagine, this was absolutely terrifying, and at first we thought that it was a person or group of people out there walking up on our camp and that it was dangerous. We were all frozen with fear though, but then adrenaline suddenly hit. As we freaked out and started to run to our ATV, all four of us saw what we all described as a tall black shadow man wearing what looked like a hat, relaxing against the front of our ATV. It straightened up when we saw it, and it saw us allegedly, and it just sort of hung there staring at us for a few seconds. No feet, the legs ended in sort of wavy lines like looking above the fire at the heat waves. It stood out against the dark night behind it though, and it was definitely there. The girl screamed, which broke our fear freeze, and it zipped like the Flash back towards the train tunnels people had died in. Interestingly, when we went to start the ATV, it sort of turned over sluggishly as if the battery had been slightly drained, despite working fine not long before when we rode it down. This entire event happened over the course of, I don't know, I want to say maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and within an hour of the sun going down. After putting our story out there, I received a lot of feedback from people as well who have also had bad encounters in this area over many years. Even a guy I worked with who didn't know that we knew this area told me that my uncle had hired him to trap in that area, and it was the only place that he didn't check traps alone at night. He said that it was almost like the animals leave the place at night and it was completely quiet out there. No less than a month later, my uncle who owns the property was up on the hill raccoon hunting at night with a dog. At some point the dog was on a rock face up above him and actually knocked a large rock loose that fell and struck my uncle in the side of the neck. This understandably messed him up pretty bad and paralyzed almost his entire body, but he still had limited functionality in his left side. We could never figure out how he got himself back to his ATV and turned it over and drove himself out of there because, really, I mean, he just wasn't capable of that anymore. It wasn't until probably maybe 2 or 3 years later, around Halloween, when my story makes its rounds on the local Facebook groups, that my uncle texted my mother out of the blue. You have no reason to believe my uncle's character reference, but honestly, he is a salt-of-the-earth, hunting, farming, working sort of man, even working past his retirement as a millionaire. He's honest, funny, and just incredibly a stand-up guy. He is easygoing, but also no nonsense for sure. In his text to my mother, though, he said, "I've never told anybody this before, and I probably won't again. But the man in the hat that the kids saw at the creek that night helped pick me up off the ground and put me back on the ATV and turned me around." Until I heard that, I had always assumed that the Shadow Man was the one who was trying to scare us out of there, but thinking back on it, maybe he was the one whispering to us, telling us that we needed to leave and possibly avoid something scarier and more dangerous. Although I honestly have no idea what could have been scarier than that. So I just wanted to come on here and talk about my house and some of the weird stuff that's been going on recently in it. I've lived in this house alone for about 5 years now, I would say. Nothing really noteworthy happened until 2021, and it really wasn't anything crazy. Like small stuff. My garage door would be open when I thought that I'd closed it. The sink is running, cupboards open, etc. I started noticing other stuff happening around that time as well, though. I would think that I'd hear footsteps around my house, but it was always something that I thought that I could play off as just being tired since my work full-time along with college and all that. It didn't happen all too often as well, so I didn't really worry too much about it. But it started to become more frequent as years have gone by, and recently a few things have happened that have definitely got me pretty spooked, to the point that I've stayed at a friend's house because of them. I'll share them now, but I'm really not sure what I want out of this. Maybe some clarity or something, or some advice on what to do, but yeah, here's what happened. So the first thing that happened was around August of 2024. I was sitting in my office room doing some homework and playing some music. I started to hear what I thought sounded like a woman at my door. Now, I note, my next door neighbor is a single mother and she goes on walks past my house literally every night. Figuring that she might be at my door asking for something, I open the door, only to find no one there. I close the door and sit back down, and over the next week or so, I started hearing what I thought was a woman talking just out of earshot. I would think that it was my TVs, but I keep them off when I'm not using them. I was pretty stumped and frustrated over it as well. It all built up to one night where I'm laying in bed and I hear this same voice, lady just out of earshot, talking at my bedroom door. Tired and creeped out, I jumped out of bed to check, only to find when opening my door, nobody was there. It chilled me enough to where goosebumps formed. I locked my bedroom door, which I never do, and got back into bed. Maybe 5 minutes later, it started happening again. I got back up and literally screamed, "Leave me alone," packed a bag, and I ended up spending the night at a friend's house a little ways down the street, and it hasn't happened since. The next incident happened about a month ago. Doing homework in my room, all of a sudden my home phone starts ringing. Problem is that I haven't had a phone connected since the hurricane swept through Florida, and have had no reason to put it back in. I quickly jumped out of my bed, shuffled out to check the phone, and sure enough, it's ringing at me. I picked it up and it immediately died. I have absolutely no clue how this could have rung as well, unless the phone battery is jacked up or something. Since then, I have thrown the phone away because, to heck with that, right? Now, this next one is the one that made me want to come on here and talk about my experience thus far. This happened about a week ago. So, I have a boxer puppy who turns 1 on Saturday, by the way, who is usually pretty relaxed. I've never seen him frightened because, frankly, he just doesn't even know what's going on half the time. It's probably about 1 or 2 in the morning. I'm chilling in my kitchen. Knox is laying next to me, probably wanting my food. Eventually, he walks away, and as I finally indulge into said food, he stops about 6 feet from my garage door and starts growling. Like, tail up, looking like he's going to bite someone, kind of growl. Mind you, I've never seen him growl like this, not once, so I was a little bit freaked out from the get-go, to say the least. I try calling him back over, but he is absolutely dialed into whatever he's growling at. I start walking over slowly to him. I turn the corner to look at my door, and it literally slams. It sounds like a giant object slammed right into my door, loud as anything. My dog jumps back and runs to go hide in my room. I, on the other hand, open my door, run into my garage to see if someone had tried to break in, only to see that everything was perfectly quiet. The door was fine too. Needless to say, I grabbed the dog up and we drove to stay at my friend's house for the night again after that. Since then too, I've been on edge the past week being at my own home. It feels like I have to watch my back constantly now because something just might happen. I'm losing sleep over this, and honestly, I really just don't know what to do at this point. This happened about a year back. I was standing in my balcony around 3 a.m. at night, smoking a cigarette. I was facing the window, and in the window I saw a reflection of something sitting on the rooftop of the building opposite across the street. I turned around and there was nothing. I continued smoking, and as I look up at the roof again, I saw a dark figure sitting on the ledge of the building. It wasn't sitting normal too, kind of like how Spider-Man sits on a light pole, like it was hunting for something. I kept looking at it, trying to figure out what it was and if it's really what I think it is, or am I just sleep deprived or something. After like half a minute of me staring though, I felt like it looked back at me, and I just kept staring at it, and I was completely lost. It was a little bit dark, but I'm certain that this thing had almost human-like features, but in the most messed up way imaginable. A skin that kind of looked burnt, and I'm sure that it didn't have eyeballs and just two empty eye sockets. When I realized what I was doing, I immediately turned my head down. Just a second later, I looked up again, and it was gone. I went inside and drank some water, and I then hear a scream coming from somewhere nearby. I went to my balcony again, and the screaming didn't stop. It sounded like a woman, but there were no breaks in the scream. It was a continuous loud scream. Me being a bit of an idiot, I went downstairs and started walking towards the sound. The road was dimly lit and not a soul in sight. I walked, and I think about maybe 500 meters in, I realized suddenly that the sound was exactly like it was from my balcony. The sound should have been louder, much louder, but it was exactly the same. So I kept walking towards the sound, and I walked for a while and still didn't get any louder. Every once in a while I would forget that I was walking, or even where, and just kept walking, and then I would sort of snap back as well. It was a really strange feeling, and at this point I realized that I had come quite far from my house to an almost barren area. So I started walking back towards my house, and the screaming didn't stop. It was an extremely eerie sound, almost human but not quite. A human's breath while screaming, but whatever it was, it didn't sound right. It's almost like I was drawn towards it too. Anyway, I eventually reached home and opened a can of beer, and after a while I went to sleep. I woke up the next morning and went to that rooftop to see if I could find anything. I first inspected the spot that I first saw in the reflection, and then the ledge, and there was nothing. I used baby powder as well. Don't judge, I know, kind of cringe. And a transparent tape too, to see if I could find a fingerprint or find any cells in the sample, but in the end I found nothing. Now, here's the thing though. I don't really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, like, at all. I honestly still don't because, well, I'm just a scientist at heart. But I cannot for the life of me find an explanation for this incident. It never haunts me. I didn't lose any sleep over it or anything, but I still wonder what it could have been. I know I wasn't seeing things. I mean, I wasn't drunk or high or anything. I guess the reason that I'm sharing this story after a year is because, well, 3 days ago, I was sitting with my friends and we were sharing weird things that we haven't told anyone about, and I shared this incident with them and they were pretty terrified by it, especially because they know that I'm the kind of guy who laughs at someone who claims that they saw a ghost or even someone who believes in one. A friend told me that she didn't sleep the night after going home and recommended that I share it here to ask people what they think it was. So, what do you think that it was? I'm sharing this because I found this place tonight, and I thought that I would share something that I've experienced probably around 2005 to 2006, when I was about 10 to 11 years old. I've never told anyone about this, and I always felt the need to, though. It's just one of those things that I'll always remember, I guess. So, When I was a kid, we used to go on these monthly vacations in August to a beach town here in Portugal called Sesimbra. It was always very fun, going to the beach every day, playing football with my cousins, going out for dinner to eat seafood. Honestly, it was a really great time to be Portuguese and travel in your own country. Anyways, this old lady would arrange us beachfront apartments every year, and it would vary, some worse, some better. There's this huge building at the end of California Beach, though, which seems to be falling off the edge, and there's these sort of wooden stairs that you need to climb to directly access the building from the beach. If you've been there, then you'll know what I'm talking about, but we were spending the monthly vacation on this building specifically, on one of the top floors. I believe it was the 8th floor, and I used to sleep in the living room couch, which had access to the balcony. I cannot remember sleeping alone on a regular basis, mainly because I was really scared of the dark and being alone at that age. Usually my dad would sleep there as well, while my grandparents stayed in the only bedroom. However, I can't remember why he wasn't there this particular night. But since he worked a full-time job, he would often stay only for 2 weeks instead of the whole month, so it's probably why, I would guess. But anyway, all of that is to say that I was sleeping when I woke up, startled, and I couldn't move. I was conscious, and I don't think it was sleep paralysis or anything like that. I was just terrified because of what I was hearing and seeing. It was a loud buzzing sound and a sort of light blue light covering the whole living room. I swear to you as well that I was so scared that I just couldn't face it, because I felt like this presence, or whatever it was, wasn't good. I don't think it was evil or demonic or whatever, but just terrifying and sort of threatening. It seemed to be some kind of a UFO just hovering near the balcony. I promised myself not to move until it was gone, and then the weirdest thing is that I cannot remember if I fell asleep again or if I simply waited for it to go away, but the next thing that I remember is that it was morning. What I do remember, though, is thinking to myself, this isn't a dream, this is real, and I won't forget that this is really happening. So obviously I remember that part, but as for that time gap, I have no idea what happened. Anyway, this felt good to get it off my chest after so many years and finally voice it and tell some other people. If you have any input or if you would like to share any thoughts, then please do. One night, while I was about 17 or maybe 18, I was living in this old Victorian home on the top floor. I lived alone. You could afford to live alone back then. And it was a creepy place. I loved the upstairs. It was very nicely done, and it was only $279 a month, close to the downtown of the city that I was living in. Now, one night, I was unexpectedly in for the evening. I had a full-time job, a part-time job as well, and a very active social life, so being home alone was pretty rare for me. It was raining very hard that day, and I remember looking outside and watching the puddles get bigger and bigger. I went to bed quite early. Suddenly, though, I woke up abruptly after what felt like I had been sleeping for a long time. It was completely dark, almost pitch black in my bedroom. There was just a bit of light in the corner of my room from the streetlight outside. I looked to my digital bedside clock. I had only been asleep for 5 minutes at the most, though. I kind of got chills then, and I heard what I can only describe as like a hissing sound. I looked up to the ceiling of my bedroom, and there was a black blob-like form that was just moving and changing size and slowly making its way to me. By the time the realization that it was coming to me hit me, I became unable to move my limbs, my body. I could not talk or scream. I just laid there, unable to do anything but watch it get closer to me. When it reached me, it just kind of settled on me. I could feel its weight. I couldn't close my eyes. I so desperately wanted to, but I just couldn't. The terror that I felt cannot be described though. The evil that I felt from this form was immense, and I have not felt anything like this, that kind of evil, in my life ever. After what seemed like hours, though, suddenly it was gone. My room got brighter and I was able to move again. I checked my clock, but again, only 5 minutes had passed. This experience happened 2 more times while I was living in that old Victorian house. I later learned, though, through research at the library, that I had apparently been visited by an incubus. When I returned to the city that I grew up in and lived in that house, I drive by it. It's still standing, and I don't know if it's divided up into 3 separate apartments now, but it's a lot more run down, that's for sure. A lot of strange things would happen in those rooms. Things would go missing and I'd find them in very odd places. And as far as I'm concerned, that house, it's definitely haunted. For a little bit of context, this happened last year around February. I am 17 and I'm a female. So, it was a random day. I had just finished school and I was home. I've always been very scared when I'm home alone, but it's not like all the time, but sometimes it just gets to me and I feel very bad and a bit paranoid, really. I'm just going to describe to you as well how my hallway is made so that you can understand the context to this story. So at the beginning of the hallway, there's my bedroom on the left, and after that, there's my parents' bedroom, still on the left, and at the end there's the bathroom that is the toilet too. The door to the bathroom is weird though, because there's sort of a curved window in it, so if I'm inside the bathroom I can see movements, and vice versa. If I'm outside, I can also see movements from inside the bathroom, but it's not very clear. Anyway, so I was in my room and I decided to go to the toilet that was in the bathroom. And when I was in it, I didn't close the door or anything because, like I said, I was home alone. And then I heard a sound coming from my parents' room. Like the floor was creaking and somebody was walking towards me. Of course, I locked the door right away. And so, I had 10% on my phone and all that in all the horror movies. But honestly, I have 0 survival skills, and I didn't think that it was that serious, so I called a friend on FaceTime and told her everything, but really I was scared, but sort of still laughing. It's what I do when I get terrified. So I decided to approach the said curved window that I mentioned earlier, and that was when I saw a man. I started to scream like I'm calling the police and leave and stuff like this. I didn't have a lot of battery on my phone, but I decided at this point to call my dad, who quickly rushed home. But still, at this point, I had no battery and I just had to pray for my dad to get home quickly. I was scared, and I imagined that when my dad was going to open the front door that the man was going to jump on him or something like that. After about 45 minutes, where I was just sitting in the bathroom on the toilet, but holding the door in case the man tried to push it open, my dad finally arrived. And trust me, I heard the floor creak again. And then my dad told me that I could come out and that there was really nothing there. In fact, there were no windows open or anything. I was really confused by that, and I think about this whole thing often. Did I imagine everything, or did something really happen? Just so you know as well, I'm really not into the supernatural stuff or explanations, so my theory is that somebody actually broke into the house at some point. I happened to come home at around that moment. They hid, they were somewhere around the house, and they got out before my dad got home. Really, that's the only logical explanation for it. Still though, whether paranormal or not, that is a terrifying thought. About 6 or 7 years ago, a friend and I were on our way to visit another friend of ours who had moved to a small town for a teaching job in a state high school. All of us grew up in the same seaside state capital, and the small town in question is about 120 kilometers of bad road, curvy and slippery, but through it is a very scenic route as it goes through hills and also a natural reserve. Now, I cannot remember much of the tree trip per se, but really it doesn't matter too much. I was driving and we hopped onto the highway that goes inland. Rain was pouring down and we were listening to Black Flag whilst talking about music when I stopped at a gas station because the gas was getting low, and this friend and I, we're kind of charmers, so we start some small talk with the cashier and I mention that we're going somewhere. The cashier then mentions a shortcut through a dirt road instead of the usual highway, citing that it would cut 30 minutes short off the trip, but that it wasn't really that safe given the weather conditions. I emphasized that it was raining hard, but we were both idiots and, at the time, drunk idiots as well, so we kept an eye on the entrance and took the shortcut. It was a rocky road that cut through the Atlantic forest, probably illegal since it also cut through a national park. Due to the heavy rain, as you can imagine, it was especially rocky and muddy, so I had to keep a steady speed of about 5 to 10 kilometers per hour, in a Ford Ka 2015, mind you. There was not a single light in sight as well. Not a house, not a street light, only the car headlights showing nothing but water pouring down, and a disgustingly horrible road ahead. We were joking about how the rain stopped, and my friend said that he wanted to take that chance to take a bit of a leak, so I just stopped in the middle of the road and I told him to hurry up. He then covers his shoes with a pair of plastic bags from the beers that we bought and goes to the front of the car. I honk a few times just for the heck of it to take a few laughs of the situation, and he moves a little bit forward where the headlight sort of doesn't hit him anymore. And it took the time to light a cigarette to hear him kind of exclaim, sort of yell in fright, I guess, like when you're taken by surprise by something. And the guy ran back to the car, slipping and falling on the ground and messing up all of my passenger seat with his muddy pants and slamming the door. He then looks at me and says that he saw what he believed was a mountain lion or something like that, and that I should slam the gas and get the heck out of here. Obviously, I couldn't do that because of the conditions. Also, it would mess up my car's suspension. Instead, I turn off the music, we wait a little bit, and nothing happens. But after about 20 seconds, we both see a huge, and I mean absolutely massive figure move between the trees. It was at least 2 meters tall or so, and we couldn't really see much of it. Only black fur and the eyes that reflected the car's headlights. But as fast as we saw it, the thing went left and back into the woods. I think that I speak for both of us when I say that we were absolutely frozen and ecstatic all at the same time. To this day, I still don't know how I could remain calm enough to start the car and slowly drive away to our friend's place. We told him about it, and he said that it was probably a mountain lion still, but I don't know. Mountain lions aren't typically 2 meters tall. They may be horizontally that long, but not tall. And I swear that I could hear its footsteps as it ran away as well, despite the windows being closed, so whatever it was also extremely heavy. Anyway, I just wanted to share this in case anybody out there might know what the heck we saw that night. I was born and raised in Denmark, but I originate from Macedonia, and my whole childhood we mostly visited Macedonia by car, rarely by plane, which is a 2-day trip. We always either ended up sleeping in Hungary or Serbia as well. My parents always preferred to spend the night in Subotica, Serbia, the first city after the Hungarian-Serbian border, because many travelers had had bad experiences, including my grandparents, with robbery in that region of Hungary. Now, I was about 8 or 9 when this happened. We got a motel in Subotica, don't know which one, but we got 2 rooms. My brother shared the room with my father, and I shared it with my mother. The motel room was pretty standard, Right to the entrance was the bathroom, and the entire wall on the left of the entrance were wardrobes, drawers, and in between those, there was a table with a mirror above it. There were 2 twin beds, which I didn't like because when I was a kid I couldn't sleep without feeling that there was a person behind my back as I sleep on my side. I used to sleep in my brother's room even though I had my own room, but my mum slept on the bed closest to the entrance and I slept closest to the windows. As I said, I couldn't fall asleep because I was scared to turn my back to the open, so I was just sort of laying there on my back listening to my mum snoring. I was awake for a long time, trying desperately to fall asleep on my back, and at one point I heard a crack near the entrance. I calmed myself down because, it's old furniture and it cracks, right? Plus, that often happens at home anyway too, but then the drawer closer to the beds, on the left of the mirror, cracked even louder than the one at the entrance. At this point, I was really scared. I probably stopped breathing to hear if anything else was going to happen. I always hold my breath when I'm scared and focusing at the same time. But it was quiet. And instead, I see a silhouette in the mirror. Not on our side, but inside the mirror, pass slowly. It was like grey smoke almost. It went from left to right, and when it went out of the frame, it was very quiet for a couple of seconds. And then the wardrobe on the right side of the mirror, it made a huge bang, as if somebody had punched it with all their force. I was obviously scared, and I didn't move nor close my eyes. I just stared at the wall for hours before, eventually, I must have fallen asleep. Now, you might wonder why I didn't wake my mum or start screaming, and to tell you the truth, I really don't know why either. My parents always told me ghosts aren't real, so I'm guessing that was probably the reason. Because I am mostly scared of not being believed, which is also the reason that I haven't spoken about this to many people. Another reason was that I am a boy, and when I was little I had been told to man up a lot. So I didn't want to show any signs of weakness, I guess, and another reason too was probably also the fact that I was too scared to move or do anything. I was completely frozen. Today, I wish that I had said something to my mum, though. As a kid, I thought that both my parents didn't believe in the paranormal, but now I know that my mum does. My dad doesn't, though. So in recent years, I told her, and she said that I should have woken her up, but she also said that I was a kid, implying that I don't remember the situation all that well. I've also told my brother about this, and he believes what I saw, but he thinks that it was some kind of my mind playing tricks on me thing because I was scared, which I'll admit is a possibility, but really I don't think so. Another possibility I thought of, though, was that I had a sleep paralysis episode. That was an ongoing theory of mine up until the point that I actually experienced sleep paralysis once, and it wasn't the same as that time in Serbia. In Serbia, I was wide awake the entire time. I never really fell asleep prior to the event with the said silhouette. I have had other creepy encounters, but for all of them I always thought of a rational explanation. This one, though, this is the one that bugs me, because genuinely I just really don't know what to make of it. After my experience with sleep paralysis, I've started to believe a bit more in this stuff. Not because of the sleep paralysis itself, but because I know now that the encounter in Serbia really wasn't sleep paralysis. And I'm sharing this because, well, I want more people to see it or hear it and tell me if they know anything about this. I would be happy to take any answers, questions, or information that you guys might be able to provide. For over a decade, I made an annual pilgrimage to Joshua Tree National Park in Southern California. This would have been spring of 1999. No smartphones, no Wi-Fi, no MapQuest. At that time, the roads in the park were largely sand and unpaved. There was no water in the park, and you needed to fill up at whatever entrance that you were at. I don't recall ever seeing a manned park ranger booth during any of my time there. I did climb a loop through Utah's Canyonlands though, Zion and Arches and then Joshua Tree, so I had an annual pass, not that anyone was really checking though. There was construction going on in the park at the time. They were improving some roads and there was some more signage for the campgrounds that had been there before. We had a construction crew with a trailer a few spots away from us. I don't remember what campground that we were at, but maybe Ryan or Jumbo Rocks or something like that. We had a favorite spot though that had a cave in the back of the site, a great place to cool down in the afternoon heat and to seek shelter during the occasional rain or snow that sometimes hit before dawn. Now, let me just say that the desert, it really attracts weirdos. People seeking to get detached from civilization, I guess, or running from problems maybe. In fact, Charles Manson's ranch wasn't actually that far from here. Many bodies had been buried out here as well, and we frequently met out fellow campers and had communal dinners with those that we met. We quickly met a guy named Chris from Virginia, maybe West Virginia if I recall correctly. He had been living in the campground for a while and riding his bike, don't ask me how, to do a job that he had a diner in one of the park's entrances at. I don't remember if it was 29 Palms or Joshua Tree, but it was one of them. Chris was an environmental activist and was not pleased with the park improvements. He would wax on how they shouldn't be making the park more accessible and had even vandalized some of the signage. I didn't agree with his actions, but I did understand the sentiment. We also met a very mentally ill woman who had been living at the end of the cul-de-sac of the campground. She had shrines to something set up everywhere and empty bottles hanging from trees, some odd decorations that she had created with wire and trash. I remember that she was sort of wild-eyed, dark-haired and very antisocial. She talked in word salads and to herself non-stop. We just avoided her really. There was a white or cream Toyota wagon with Delaware plates next to the woman though. The car was packed full of banker's boxes and clearly someone had been living out of that car. It was an odd sight as the roads were just sand and even with my Subaru, some roads were pretty tough to get through. The owner of the Toyota wagon was a guy, and his name started with D, or had a D, but that has been lost with time, and so maybe it was Darren or possibly Andrew, I guess, but I've searched online for any trace of what I expect happened with him, but I just never found a thing. Anyway, D was odd to say the least. He was a businessman and dressed business casual, but his demeanor was just off. I was a therapist at the time, and I immediately got bad vibes from this guy. His story was that he had gotten a divorce and was doing some self-exploration. I didn't buy it, not for one bit. He oozed abusive and sociopath. He came to our campsite with Chris and stayed long beyond his welcome. My climber partner was an aspiring actress, largely theatre, and was a social butterfly. D would turn any questions asked back to us, a common way to change the narrative. My friend loved the attention though, and answered where she lived, worked, went to school, etc. I was honestly horrified by this, and sat quietly trying to memorize everything about D. We later developed a bit of a safe word after this event though. D though was practically drooling over my friend, and she was welcoming it too, and sharing far too much. D finally left camp, and we had already invited him to spaghetti dinner the next night with Chris. The next day, we didn't see Chris at all though. No worries, maybe he was working. That evening I cooked dinner and my friend went to get Chris to join us. His camp was set up but empty. His bike was there. D came over for dinner and we asked if he had actually seen Chris. He told us that Chris told him to meet him later that night off of one of the jeep trails deep in the desert. I don't remember which trail now, but it was a well-known one, deep in the desert, and we had encountered a jeep stuck out there a few days before. It really wasn't passable, and definitely we couldn't walk there. So I agreed to drive us out there after dinner. Dee was hyper-focused on my friend once more, and even though we had the "he's weird, don't give him your personal details" talk, she was definitely happy to have the attention. We had dinner though, and then we headed out to see Chris. I was driving, friend in the passenger seat, Dee behind her. Dee had a backpack on his lap, and I had a terrible feeling that there was a gun in it. We got to the remote location Dee said Chris was going to meet us at. No Chris though, no anyone. We were also 2+ hours from the nearest town now. Dee said, "This is the place, we need to get out and hike to Chris." And it was here that my gut was telling me that if I left my car, I was dead. I kept imagining Dee pulling a gun to my friend's head and making me get out of the car to my death. It was pitch black out too. The stars were the only light. I told Dee that we were not getting out. He was welcome to, but I was heading back to camp. Dee was angry. I told him that he could leave the vehicle, but he didn't, and the drive back was silent. Dee was furious, and I was terrified. Back at camp, still no Chris. Dee wanted to sit around the fire though, and I said that I was going to bed. My friend joined me, and very quietly we had a conversation of what had transpired. She agreed though that Dee was dangerous, and also felt like he was going to pull a gun out of that backpack too. We discussed driving back into J-Tree or 29 Palms and going to the police, but, what would we tell them? I had long purple dreads, a friend had bright red hair, we were early 20s, clearly countercultural, and presenting to a military conservative town police force would likely result in us being dismissed or worse, maybe even detained. We talked about going to talk to the construction crew who was loudly drinking and playing poker, but again, 2 early 20s girls alone in the desert, it could go very bad for us. We agreed to sleep in my blacked out Subaru wagon that night instead. I carried a large machete that I'd brought back from the jungle trip that I'd been on before. It was sharp, but a pretty clumsy weapon if I'm being honest. My Subaru windows were so dark that any time that I strayed east of California on the I-10, I was pulled over and cited. In fact, it happened at least 5 times every year on our treks across Arizona and all that, especially Texas. I don't think either of us slept well that night, but my friend had previously told Dee that our next trip was going to be Carlsbad Caverns, and Dee was allegedly going to meet us there. Well, when we got up, we quickly found Dee in our sight. "Where were you guys?" he asked. "I checked your tent." My blood instantly ran cold. We told him that we slept in the cave behind our site that night. We asked him if he had seen Chris, but no. We were quickly packing up our camp to get the heck away from Dee, and Dee told us that he would meet us at Carlsbad. But my friend and I, we had already changed plans to hit Mesa Verde instead. We checked Chris's site before we left camp, but there was no Chris. His bike was still parked where it had been, but he was nowhere to be seen. In an act of desperation, we asked the wild-eyed lady if she had seen him anywhere. She said not for a few days, and so we left and we headed east. Now, I truly believe that it's possible that Dee actually killed Chris and was planning on killing us. I don't have any evidence for this, obviously, but I have not seen Chris ever since that moment. I've searched online in so many ways trying to find anything on Dee or what he was running from. I actually took down his license plate number and full name in my journal, but I just never found a thing. I do hope, though, that whatever Dee was running from, that it eventually caught up to him. So last year, I took my friend and my bonus kiddo, his child, to view the Perseid meteor showers at a remote mountaintop horse camp deep in the wilderness. There was no cell phone reception, no power lines up there, just quiet and very dark skies. Even though it was late summer and hot as heck out there, the camp was empty. It's a large 100 acres or so camp, and there was not a single human or even a horse in sight. And that was odd. We pulled out our camp chairs though and set up at the top of a large sloping meadow, bordered by some scrubby pine, but a perfect outdoor auditorium for the Perseids. Kiddo was 11 and had never been that deep in the wilderness. Neither parent was into the outdoors. He was freaked out by bugs and prospect of creepy crawlies that he could not see, but I've taken his father into the wilderness many times, and we had just been collecting sage on my native res. And while we were sitting in our chairs, I noticed that all of the bug chatter just suddenly stopped. It was suddenly just dead silent. My blood ran cold and I got goosebumps at this. A deer-like animal appeared slowly out of the side of the meadow near the bottom. I say deer, but its neck was far too long, and not at the right angle either, like it was a puppet and being moved in jerky motions. The animal made eye contact though and stayed there watching us, occasionally taking a few steps closer, but not close enough to see it clearly or close enough that I felt threatened. I had my binoculars in my car, but really didn't want to see whatever it was pretending to be a deer, and I think that it was letting us know that we were on its land. It was grazing, and its giraffe neck with the weird angles reminded me of the large puppets used in native ceremonies that mimic nature sometimes. I stayed calm, even though I was terrified, and the bug or the night noises, they just never returned. I did catch a few amazing views that night, but I kept my eye closely on that deer until we left. It was only when we were safe at home and Kiddo was tucked into bed that I did share my thoughts with my buddy.